Good afternoon. Welcome to Arizona Lower Basin Drought Contingency Plan Steering Committee meeting number 6. And I might just mention that many of the folks that are in the room right now were already here for 2 other meetings this morning that were respectively Mitigation Workgroup meeting number 5 and Tribal ICS meeting number, was it 4 or 3? Well, whatever. So we've had like 15 meetings in the last couple of months. Lots of important work is going on. It's hard work. I believe we're making progress, but there is much more work to do, and every day that goes by is time that's running out. But thank you all for your participation and your interest in this. Enough said for now. So what we'll do is we do every meeting is run through the agenda really quickly. In a moment, we'll have welcome and introductions. We've got a special guest star today. We will be having a hydrology update from the Bureau of Reclamation. Dr. Dan Bunk is here to do that for us from the Boulder City office. We know that the August 24-month study now is a couple of months old, so this will be a chance for us all to catch up on what has happened since then and what the latest thoughts are about hydrology projections going forward. We will have an update and a report from the small group discussions, and what those are, to remind everyone, is the reason that we stacked up the work group meetings with the steering committee today was to provide some space since the last steering committee meeting 2 weeks ago and today to have discussions with smaller groups of constituents. There's a long list, and there have been many meetings over the last 2 weeks, probably fewer than we needed, but many of them. And you'll get an update on that, at least in aggregate, today. And then also an update from the 2 work groups, and both that met this morning. And I won't steal any thunder from any of that. And then, as always, delegates' comments. And then preparation for and plans for next steps and our next steering committee meeting that's 2 weeks from tomorrow. Tom, do you want to mention anything about documents?
Sure. So you'll see on the agenda that from 4 to 5 time frame, we have a post-meeting workshop and handout of drought contingency plan documents. Jay Johnson and Nicole Clovis, CAWCD and DWR respectively lawyers. We're going to take that time to go through and explain what all the documents are and run through them. They'll be posted on our website, CWC and DWR website at that point in time. But I urge you to stick around so you can hear that explanation, give you some context, and then folks can go back and start powering through those documents in detail. The documents that all relate to both the upper basin and lower basin drought contingency plans and putting all of those into final process, so to speak. So I think that'll be a good conversation. And I think the documents are probably already posted on Reclamation's website, Leslie?
Yes, they went up at 8 o'clock this morning.
Don't be going and looking at them while we're having our meeting. Okay, please wait.
Right, so again, that will happen when the steering committee meeting ends, estimating at 4 o'clock. Maybe we'll be done sooner or later. We'll see.
So now let's continue with the introductions. Tim, we're going to give you a pass here this time and start over here. You did such a good job. Yeah, you need to retire undefeated. So we'll start over here with Joshua.
Josh Rees, Deputy Attorney General for the Tohono-O'odham Nation, filling in for Chairman Edward Manuel.
Stephanie Smallhouse, Arizona Farm Bureau. Alternate is Philip Bashaw.
David Brown, Arizona Cattle Growers.
Paul Lorm, Pinell County Agriculture. My alternate is Dan Jones.
Good afternoon, Ted Kowalski with the Walton Family Foundation representing NGOs, and Kevin Moran is my alternate. Brian Biesmeyer, Scottsdale Water, and Kathy Rawl is my alternate.
Virginia O'Connell, Arizona Water Bank. Terry Surossi is my alternate.
Laura Grignano, CAGRD. Perry Benamelis is my alternate.
Doug Dunham, Core Water, sitting in for Joe Geisel.
Senator Lisa Otondo, Legislative District 4, and my alternate is Senator Andrea D'Alessandro.
Spencer Cams, Home Builders Association of Central Arizona. My alternate is Rob Anderson.
Senator Gail Griffin for District 14. My alternate is Jeff Cross.
Rusty Bowers, District 25. My alternate is Representative Dave Cook.
Glenn Hammer, Arizona Chamber of Commerce and Industry. My alternate is Courtney McKinstry.
Governor Stephen Lewis of the Gila River Indian Community, and my alternate is Councilman Dixon from our District 5 in Gila River. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Hunter Moore, Governor's Office.
Tom Buchowski, DWR Director. My alternate is Clint Chandler.
Ted Cook, Central Arizona Project. My alternate is Suzanne Tickner.
Leslie Myers with the Bureau of Reclamation.
Lisa Atkins, CAWCD Board, and my alternate is Jim Hallway.
Karen Caesar, CAWCD, and my alternate is Mark Taylor.
Ted Maxwell, the Southern Arizona Leadership Council. My alternate is Kip Volpe.
Keith Moses, Vice Chairman for the Colorado River Indian Tribes. I'm the alternate for Chairman Patch today.
Wally Wilson with Metro Water District. I'm standing in for Joe Olson.
Javier Sedovich, City of Goodyear. My alternate is Dan Cotterman.
Cynthia Campbell for the City of Phoenix. I'm the alternate for Catherine Sorensen.
Bill Garfield, Arizona Water Company. My alternate is Fred Schneider.
Wade Noble, Yuma County Agriculture Water Coalition.
Brian Wong representing Pima County Agriculture, and my alternate is John Kamik.
My name is Inigo Montoya. Just making sure everybody's paying attention. We've done this a few times today. Shane Leonard, Maricopa County Ag, Roosevelt Water Conservation District, and my alternate is Brad Strader.
Jamie Kelly, Mojave County Water Authority, alternate to Lois Wakimoto.
Sandy Fabritz with Freeport.
Dave Roberts with Salt River Project, and my alternate is Chuck Podolak.
Cheryl Lombard, Valley Partnership. My alternate is John Graham with Sunbelt Holdings.
Good afternoon. I'm Rosanna Gavardon, Arizona State Representative, Legislative District 2. My alternate is Representative Kirsten Engel.
Good afternoon. Tim Tomier, Director of Tucson Water, and my alternate is Andrew Greenhill.
And I was late to the table. Dennis Rule for Southern Arizona Home Builders, alternate for David Godleski, who is on his way.
Thank you. I'm actually only going to spend some time on this slide to remind everybody of the remaining scheduled meetings. For right now, and we ran out of time to go through the deck one more time, so I'm not sure why this slide is here, but we have 3 more meetings scheduled as was expressed in earlier meetings. Even though we've got 3 scheduled, we'd really like to try and wrap things up by the next to last meeting, November 8th. In the event that we don't have every single detail developed and every agreement in place that we need to, we have discussed the concept of having a non-binding letter or letters of commitment or a resolution from this body, non-binding resolution of what our intent is with respect to DCP, so we can keep the schedule going in the larger context of the interstate discussion and congressional and governing board and Arizona State Legislature approval. We'll come back to the October 25th date. I think at the end of this meeting, it will make more sense to talk about that, provide more context for that. And then if necessary, we've got November 29th as an additional scheduled meeting. So now I think here is some very interesting update from Dan Bunk from the Bureau of Reclamation. Dan, do you want to come in and sit? Oh, there's a spare seat right here. Why don't, if that would be easier, why don't you come up here, and that way you can drive.
All right, thanks Ted, and thanks Tom, and to the committee for having me here today. My name is Dan Bunk. I'm the River Operations Manager for the Boulder Canyon Operations Office, Bureau of Reclamation in Boulder City, Nevada. And I'll just giving the group a little bit of a hydrology update. As mentioned earlier, back in August, we made the operational decisions for Lake Powell and Lake Mead, at least in terms of what tiers they would operate in 2019. But since then, there's been a little bit of update to the hydrologic situation and the conditions at Lake Powell and Lake Mead, as well as some projections. And so we thought today would be a good opportunity to provide an update. So this chart here, it shows two things. One, it shows the combined storage of Lake Powell and Lake Mead, as well as what we call unregulated inflow into Lake Powell. And so those dark blue bars, that's the combined storage of Lake Powell and Lake Mead. So on the y-axis, we have a volume in millions of acre feet, and on the x-axis, we have water years starting in 1999 through water year 2018, which was just completed on September 30th. So water year is the period from October 1st through September 30th. And then on this chart, we have this light blue line that sort of cuts into the blue bars on the chart. And this is the unregulated inflow into Lake Powell. And then there's also numbers on the chart, if you can see those. So the orange numbers on the top of the blue bar, that's the percent combined capacity of the combined volume of Powell and Mead. And then those other percentages in white text, that's the percent of inflow in a given year, which line up with the years below. So, a couple of the key things on this chart is this shows the current 19-year drought period. This 19-year period is the driest on record going back to 1906, and it's one of the driest in the 1,200-year paleo record. There's only been 4 years of above average inflow during the last 19 years. And then within this period, we have all sorts of not so good statistics, such as we had the driest 5-year period on record, the driest 10-year period on record, and now the driest 19-year period on record. So there's all sorts of bad hydrologic statistics that you can take away from this chart. I think another one which is also not that good is that if you look at the blue bar under 2018, you see two numbers there. You see the 41%. That 41% is the combined capacity of Lake Powell and Lake Mead currently. And if you look at those other orange numbers, it's the lowest number, orange number that's on that chart. So right now at this point in time, the combined storage of Powell and Mead is lower than it's been over the course of this 19-year drought, as well as you have to go all the way back to something like 1966 or 1967 when Powell first started filling to find a combined storage that's lower than what we're currently at right now. The other number to look at is the 43% of average. That's the percent of average inflow that occurred in 2018. So that number, the only number that's lower on this chart is 2002. So 2018 was the second driest year during this 19-year period. And then there's only one other year in the last 100 years, 1977, that was lower than 2018 this past year. So in short, 2018 looks like it ended up as the third driest year on record in more than 100 years of record keeping. And then I've got all sorts of statistics, so I apologize for this, but I think there's even more to the story. Before the runoff season started in April, we were forecasting an inflow of about 52% of average for the water year. It actually came in about 1 million acre feet less than what we were projecting in April, And so rather than coming in at 52% of average, it's now 43% of average. So there's about 1 million acre feet of supply that didn't occur that we thought was going to occur early in the year. And one of the main reasons for that is that September was the driest September on record, and August was the second driest August on record. So the inflow in September actually didn't even round up to 1% of average. So it was less than 1% of average inflow, which essentially there was no additional inflow in September in the upper basin. So those aren't good statistics, and really the impact of that is we had a pretty good year in 2017 where the inflow was 110% of average. We were able to build a little bit of storage, in particular in Lake Powell, but unfortunately we lost that storage and a little bit more in 2018 with the poor inflow that occurred. So I think that's the bottom line for that. And so really that buffer that we saw up in Lake Powell in terms of extra storage that could help protect the Colorado River system was lost this year with this year's hydrology. So this chart here, which I see people have handouts, which is good because I didn't think the text could get any smaller, but it did now that it's further away. So this chart here, it shows a teacup diagram of the operating tiers for Lake Powell and Lake Mead. So we won't get into all the different layers of the chart for Powell and Mead, but the one thing that I'll mention is that, so for Lake Powell, which is the teacup on my left when I'm looking at it on the screen here, Powell has been operating in this tier, which is called the upper elevation balancing tier. Since for the last, I think 2019 will be the 5th year in a row that it's been operating in that tier. And one of the important aspects of this operating tier is that it allows for a mid-year adjustment to either balancing releases or equalization releases, depending on how good or how bad the hydrology is in that particular water year. So the example that I would give is that right now Lake Powell would release at least 8.23 million acre feet in water year 2019, but we're projecting what we call this mid-year adjustment to balancing releases to occur in water year 2019. Now, we don't actually make that operational adjustment until April of 2019 if the conditions are projecting that it should occur. So it's not set yet, even though our modeling is showing that to occur. And I'll talk a little bit about where the risk is with that. But at least, within this tier, there's the possibility of what we call the mid-year adjustment to Lake Powell's operation. But one difference from this year versus last year is at this time last year, Lake Powell was up here at about elevation 3625. Right now, Lake Powell's about 35 feet lower than it was to start the water year as compared to last year. And then on the other side of the diagram, we have the Lake Mead part, the Lake Mead teacup. And Lake Mead has been operating in this normal condition since we implemented the guidelines in 2007. But as you can see, this is Lake Mead's current level at about 1079. We've been hovering right around 1075, between 1075 and 1085 for the last several years, the last 5 years or so. So we're just barely holding Mead up above that first level of shortage, which would occur when Mead is projected to be below 1075. So we're still good for 2019. Mead will operate in the normal condition in 2019, but when we look forward to next August 2019 and we look ahead to 2020, there's a risk of the lower basin being in shortage in 2020. So we do a lot of modeling at Reclamation, and one of our models we call the 24-month study. I think some of the other modeling results that you've been looking at these and other meetings are from our a model called the Colorado River Simulation System. That's a model that we can model multiple scenarios and come up with probabilities of occurrence. The 24-month study is the model that we use for our operational decision-making, and it simulates a single projection. But a few times per year, we model, in addition to what this median forecast, which we call most probable, we also model this probable minimum and probable maximum study. So on this slide here, we've got Lake Powell elevations on this top chart and Lake Mead elevations on this bottom chart, and I'll kind of just talk through Lake Powell first, and then we'll look at Lake Mead. So we've got Powell's elevation on the y-axis, and then we have this monthly time step on the x-axis. And so this dark line here is Powell's historical elevation since January of 2017. And then we have these three projections from the 24-month study, this probable maximum, which is a wetter scenario, this probable minimum, which is a drier scenario, and then this most probable, which is the median scenario. So really the takeaway from the Powell slide is that there's a lot of variability. There's a lot of uncertainty in Powell's projection looking into 2019 and 2020. So if we get good inflow, Powell could recover and even potentially release a little bit more water than we're projecting. If Powell kind of stays in the middle, its elevation won't change too much, but if we have another dry year or two, then its elevation could drop pretty quickly, and then the releases out of Powell could be less than what we're projecting currently. And that has an effect on Lake Mead. The same chart for Lake Mead, where we have Lake Mead's elevation on the y-axis and this monthly time step on the x-axis. And this line right here is the 1075 line, and the one below it is 1050 right here. This wet scenario shows a recovery for Lake Mead. However, if you look at this median scenario that we call the most probable, you can see Lake Mead would kind of hover just below 1075 in 2019, which is this period in here. But by 2020, could drop down all the way to about 1050 or so. I believe it's 1050, I'm sorry, I don't have that number in there. Yep, to just above 1050 by the summer of 2020. But this min probable one is probably the scariest one, because this shows that adjustment, that mid-year adjustment not occurring in 2019. So this shows Powell releasing 8.23 million acre feet in 2019, followed by a 7.48 release in 2020. And so you can see that Lake Mead's elevation could drop pretty quickly under this scenario. And the concern is that without a drought plan in place, if we drop into these lower elevations, it'll be more difficult to slow the decline, and the recovery from these elevations would be more difficult. And I'll talk a little bit more about sort of where these triggers are between these different releases from Powell, and look again at what the impact to Lake Mead might be. So this chart here, it shows potential releases from Lake Powell in water year 2019. So this is a potential water year inflow volume on the y-axis, and then a potential Glen Canyon release or Lake Powell release on the x-axis. So this bottom part of the line, this release is equivalent to 8.23 million acre feet. And this kind of inflection point here is at about 6.5 million acre feet of inflow or so, which is about an inflow of about 64% of average. So if in 2019 the inflow is about 65% of average or less, that would mean that Powell would not balance, it would not have a mid-year adjustment, and it would release 8.23 million acre feet. And this is that minimum probable scenario shown on the last slide, and that's what this is showing right here. Now, in the range from about 64 to 70% of average inflow, we can have a balancing release, but it might not be a full 9 million acre foot balancing release. It might be 8.5 million acre feet or 8.7 million acre feet or 8.9. And Meade's elevation changes a foot every 80,000 acre feet or so. So the difference, so for example, the difference between an 823 release and a 9 million acre foot release is about 10 feet in Lake Meade elevation. So if you have an, let's just say, keep it simple, like an 8.9 million acre feet instead of 9, that means Meade's elevation would be about a foot lower, and you'd keep losing a foot or so every 80,000 acre feet till you got, so you get like this range that could occur. You're still balancing, but it's not a full 9 million acre foot. And then this line here is the 9 million acre foot line, and this occurs basically anywhere about, I believe it's about 70% of average or higher is where you'd have that 9 million acre foot balancing release occur. And then if we'd be so lucky to have a very like historically wet year, there is still a chance that equalization could occur, but it's a negligible, that chance of that happening in 2019 is negligible only because there's such a big hole that we'd have to fill in Lake Powell to kind of get to that point. And then the final slide, hopefully I'm going to try to tie everything together if I haven't lost everybody yet with too many numbers, and I appreciate your patience as I go through these. So the water year inflow in 2019 has an effect on whether or not Lake Powell has a mid-year adjustment to operations in 2019, but it also has an effect on Lake Powell's operation in 2020. So it has an effect within the current year, as well as an effect on how Powell operates in the upcoming year in 2020. And so if Lake Powell's inflow in water year 2019 is about 78% of average or greater, and there's other factors that come into play, so these are just kind of rough, not that rough estimates, but these are estimates. I mean, the number could be slightly different by a few percentage points. But in this case, Powell would release 9 million acre feet in 2019, but then it could also start out water year 2020 in the upper elevation balancing tier, which means it has the potential for a mid-year adjustment. So in this scenario, Meade's end of 2019 elevation is right around 1075, and then the end of 2020 elevation is about 1065. If the inflow into Lake Powell is in the range of about 70 to 77% of average in 2019, Powell would still release 9 million acre feet, except that the 2020 release would only be 7.48 million acre feet, which means Meade's elevation is about 1070 at the end of 2019, but perhaps as low as about 1056 by the end of calendar year 2020. If it's in the range of the 64 to 70% of average, Powell would balance in 2019, but it wouldn't be a full balance. It would be less than full. That would be followed by 748 release, and you can see Meade's elevations here. And then when you get to this one where you're at an 823 followed by a 748, you can see Meade's elevation gets low pretty quickly. We get down to about 1060 or so by the end of 2019 and about 1041 to 1047 at the end of 2020. And so these are pretty dire projections, but they're definitely not outside of the realm of possibility. All it would take is another year where the inflow would be about 75% of average or lower in 2019. And this has occurred at least, I believe, at least 3 or 4 times during this 19-year drought. So it's not unprecedented in any sense to have a year like we had in 2018, which was 43% of average, and to have something that's 65% of average or lower in the following year. So, so I think that's one of the concerns, is that if we don't have a drought contingency plan in place before heading into these years, do we have enough protection in place to kind of protect Lake Mead and the system if we happen to fall into one of these more dire scenarios that we're showing here. And that's my last slide.
So Dan, I have a couple of questions before we take questions from around the table. So first, I want to make sure that on this slide, the second row, the 70 to 77%, that is essentially the 24-month study most probable projection, correct?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Yep, yep.
And then second, what is the River Forecast Center's projection for runoff coming up this year? And I know it's early, but what was their projection?
Yeah. So actually, when we ran the September study, which is what I based this analysis on, the inflow was forecasted at about 73%. However, the October forecast, which just came out last week, is actually 70%. So right on that inflection point there.
Dan, I have a question too, and maybe it's a stupid question, but I think it's important to clarify that these forecasts do not include DCP level reductions. They do include 2007 guidelines reductions.
That's correct. Yep. They don't include. It only includes the shortage condition reductions consistent with the 2007 interim guidelines, as well as the minute 323 reductions for Mexico, but not their water scarcity contingency plan.
So questions from around the table? Sandy.
Thank you, and I'll refrain from calling you Dr. Doom, but
that would be someone else.
Appreciate it. A question on the levels. Does this include the ICS that's already been put into Mead?
Yeah, so these projections essentially are ICS neutral, so they don't include any projected ICS creation or ICS delivery that could occur in the future.
If I may, but it does include what's already been stored?
It does include what's already been stored, yes. Yep.
Mr. Chairman. Dan, can you tell me how much ICS has been stored?
Yes. So there's about 1.2 million acre feet of ICS in the lower basin states' ICS accounts as of this point. Some of that water we consider to be stored in Lake Mead, like through intentionally created surplus through extraordinary means, and that number is about 700,000 acre feet of ICS. So Lake Mead's elevation is actually propped up by about 20 or 21 feet by this combination of ICS credits that are currently stored in Lake Mead, as well as the Pilot System Conservation Program, as well as other voluntary contributions that, in particular, Arizona and Nevada have made since 2014.
So as a follow-up, so I believe, so California, for example, has about 400,000 acre feet that they've stored in Lake Mead currently under ICS, is that right?
They actually have about 550. I actually checked that right before the meeting. But the limit on how much they could take in a given year is 400,000 acre feet.
Okay.
For the state as a whole.
And so to clarify, this modeling assumes that those contributions or that those amounts are in the lake and not being withdrawn at any point?
Yeah, that's correct.
So can I ask a follow-up to that then? Are there any indications, because we're in the ordering phase of management, correct? Are there any indications that some of that ICS is being ordered? Can we predict how much of it may be taken out in any future time, or is it too early to tell?
I think it's too early to tell. Right now, our water accounting group is going through this Part 417 water approval process, and that just basically started this month. But I know there is flexibility to, create or take delivery of ICS based on water supply conditions, in California and how that might affect certain water users there. And, if it looked like shortage was imminent in, in 2020, there could be risk to leave that water in Lake Mead without a DCP in place.
Thank you.
Ted had a question.
Well, actually, I had a comment on that, so I can answer part of Hunter's questions. The only entity in Arizona with an ICS account is CWCD. And we're not done with our ordering process yet, as everyone knows, but currently there is no plan to order any of the ICS.
So I feel compelled to remind folks that one of the key provisions of the drought contingency plan itself was to create the flexibility in terms of ICS recovery or delivery that would create an incentive for the water to stay in the lake. And we have heard from California recently that they might get really pushed into a place without DCP of taking their water out of the lake rather than have it stranded as we go into shortage, as the projections show, in 2020. So there's that additional risk. What they'll actually do, we don't know. But that's adding to Dr. Doom plus, I suppose.
Yep.
But it's a real risk, and I understand why they might want to do that. But there's lots of moving parts here and lots of risks. So other questions from folks around the table? So Dan, I want to thank you for your quick response to coming down, putting this presentation together, all the work you've been doing. Alan Butler, another reclamation modeler, has been greatly helpful to us as well. And Sandy, he's actually the one who has the Dr. Doom moniker, not Dan.
Yeah.
Just for the
Get
record.
that straight.
But reclamation folks have been great in helping us along with all of this information, and we really appreciate the work.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Thanks, Ted.
So moving on then to kind of a recap from the steering committee meeting number 5. Again, the mitigation plan work group and Arizona ICS framework work group. We're targeting the October 10th steering committee today to provide recommendations. We are teeing up here for additional discussion on the 25th steering committee meeting, a discussion of excess water and Arizona compensated conservation program as well. And I think we'll have some work to do in meeting with many of you in between now and then to talk about excess water and Arizona conservation. So a couple of observations from Dan's presentation that are, I think, really important. One is it shows the increasing risks of the lake falling to the levels we're concerned with and the need for DCP, but it also shows that Tier 2 is maybe coming faster than we thought. Tier 2 has some huge implications. Comparatively to the guidelines, for example, it would pretty much wipe out CAP Ag altogether, and it creates a huge reduction for the non-Indian agricultural pool, the next priority. So that has implications for what we need to accomplish and perhaps can accomplish in the mitigation plan that we've been working on for a while. Again, so we have some slides, I think, that get into that some more further on in the presentation, some more numbers and things. Again, hopefully, total package November 9th. It's a heavy lift. We would hope to have all the documents that we need to make a plan come together in a kind of binding way, but absent that, this idea that we talked about last time of non-binding letters of support to make commitments to get us to the state legislature in time, early in 2019. That concept we still have on the table. Again, we continue to recognize that we're a long way in terms of the details to get people comfortable with signing such an agreement right now. And again, that agreement conceptually would be showing support for the intra-Arizona DCP implementation plan and also recommending to governing bodies, et cetera, that this is the time to support that plan and to support DCP. So again, as we talked about at the last meeting, the last steering committee meeting, DWR and CWCD were going to meet with small groups, key stakeholders, and we did so over the last couple of weeks. I also understand that there were other groups meeting, and some overlap there perhaps, but groups meeting internally with each other without DWR and CWCD, and that's some good work, good concepts, creative thinking was going on in a lot of those discussions, and we appreciate folks spending the time to do that. And again, we've listed the groups here. We won't go through this again. We did last time when we told you who we were going to go talk to. Again, but there's been a desire, I think, to refine the available information on mitigation and ICS tools and resources, especially water and financial resources, again, as we build support for that intra-Arizona plan. So some things to keep in mind, things we've heard from the small group discussions as well. Again, the DCP is focused on addressing the risk to reduce the risks and the uncertainty and possibly extreme cuts if Lake Mead goes below 1025, not necessarily avoiding going into shortage at 1075. And again, we don't know what those cuts are going to be when we fall below 1025, but they could be substantially more than what the 2007 guidelines have on the books for us at elevation 1025, which is 480,000 acre feet to the state of Arizona. The DCP does cut the risks in half, but of course we need to have reductions to the CAP other excess pool, water bank, that's the water bank, the CHRD and federal firming program, to the ag pool and to the non-Indian ag pool. We've seen significant interest expressed by some of the on-river users and some long-term CAP contractors, subcontractors to participate in mitigated compensated conservation from the water perspective. I think those are all good things. There are perhaps some issues there as well that we might have to deal with as we work with those folks on coming up with that water. Again, the impacts to the contractors and subcontractors in the current NIA pool, we believe, are somewhat balanced by the protection provided to those same contractors and subcontractors if we fall below 1025 and if those additional kind of large reductions are forced on Arizona, they will then trickle down to those water users. We did recognize with the increasing risks of Lake Mead going below 1050 that the NI contractors and subcontractors are definitely impacted in a different way than even when we started talking about this in May, June, July. And it's raised questions about their views of the value of the DCP. Again, the value of the DCP versus what cuts might come upon them just under the guidelines. And those are important to consider in relation to mitigation potentially for that user group. And then as we've talked through Arizona ICS framework, some of the CAP settlement tribes who we've been working with, they've expressed what we call at least moderate interest in creating tribal ICS in the near term. They recognize other ways to participate in the DCP and in the mitigation pools. And so I think one of the issues, if you look at the falling elevations of the lake and those projections, it would be pretty tough for any entity within Arizona to create ICS and then take it out of the lake. Pretty tough sell, I think, among the collective water users and the additional impact that would cause to the elevations of the lake falling. And so maybe not legally having their water stranded with DCP, but practically getting to the point where it could be stranded for quite a while until the lake recovers. So again, we wanted to remind folks So we went back to a slide we showed in the June meeting, kicking off this process of the risks of Lake Mead going below 1050 and how the drought contingency plan impacts that risk. So again, on the left, full hydrology, the gray down on the bottom, 2007 guideline projections, 20% at 2026. Green line, no DCP, over 50% in that same time frame, with the DCP cutting that down to a little bit over 30%. And again, even though the DCP was not designed to create this outcome, there is that benefit because of all the water that would be kept in the lake through the reductions at various elevations. Reductions, albeit that come from Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico, because California is still not contributing, making contributions until 1045. So with the stress test hydrology, different numbers, kind of same outcome. Gray line at the bottom, 20% probability. Without the DCP, 75%. With it, 54 or 55%. So we believe there is some benefit there that the DCP creates for those users who get substantially reduced in Tier 2 in the NIA pool. And again, this slide we showed a bunch of times. We'll show it again. Risk of the lake falling below 1025. Same thing, full hydrology on the left. Gray line at the bottom, 07 guideline projections, single digits through 2026, going up to 30% without DCP, back down into single digits with DCP. The stated goal of the DCP was that outcome. Then testing the stress test hydrology. Again, same gray line at the bottom. No DCP, up over 40% risk with the DCP below 20%. Go ahead. Is it still me? So, as we listen to folks in our small group discussions, we heard themes, we heard kind of principles coming to the fore. We tried to capture those from DWR and CWCD's perspective, and that's what this slide shows. Again, the mitigation package should provide certainty and reliability. Mitigation and ICS actions should continue to respect the priorities, the water rights settlements, and contractors' rights, and that's a small c, that's contractors and subcontractors. Mitigation and ICS participation being voluntary. Mitigation and ICS participation requiring limited waivers or agreements not to take water that might flow into their higher priority pool that is going to mitigation in lower priority pools. Again, mitigation resources plus ICS creation and delivery. And from our perspective, that seeking those waivers is really an affirmation of the protection of the rights and recognition that they have those rights to take that water. So the use of mitigation resources should potentially use CAP ICS as a safety net if other resources are unavailable. We heard a strong sentiment among many folks to preserve as much CAP ICS in the Lake Mead, and here we call it to the extent practicable. Clearly, again, falling lake levels, taking ICS out of the lake seems a little bit counterproductive, and that's what we heard a little bit before these last 2 weeks, but much more loud and clear over the last couple of weeks. And again, DWR and CWCD starting to look, along with the United States and maybe others, to look at mitigation resources, financial budget. Ted will go through the chart with the potential resources and have dollar amounts potentially tied to them. That's where the $85 to $100 million number comes from. And from my perspective, I'll share with you an idea that we are thinking about. talked a little bit about this earlier today, but so you might be aware that in the Pinal AMA, as there is in Phoenix AMA and Tucson AMA, there's a $2.50 groundwater withdrawal fee, so per acre foot of groundwater pumping that is legislatively mandated to go to the Arizona Water Banking Authority for them to store water. And the water bank has used that money to store water over the years. We've also used the 4-cent tax levied by CWCD board to store water. So there's also a 50-cent conservation and augmentation assessment in the Pinal AMA that's used for some important programs, and I'll get into that in a minute. But conceptually, the idea is to legislatively repurpose the water bank money in the Pinal AMA to be part of this mitigation resources budget. Somewhere around $9 million over the 7 years. DWR has another 4 in the 2018 and 19 budget for system conservation. That's about $13 million. We do have an issue, though, that we have to deal with. So the Conservation and Augmentation Fund in the Pinal AMA is starting to show a deficit in spending if the following 3 programs are to remain in full funding mode, and that's Pinal County Water Augmentation Authority at $200,000 per year, the Natural Resources Education Center, $30,000 a year, so important water education, conservation, et cetera program. We have those in just about every AMA. And then irrigation management services, so a program to help agricultural users work on their ag efficiencies, a very important program as well. So there's about a $75,000 or so projected deficit starting to creep in. We probably need to use some of that water bank repurposing for that money as well to keep everyone whole in Pinal County if we go down that path. Okay, I'll try to move closer to the mic. Let's go, Ted.
While we're talking about funding, I wanted to mention too, and I mentioned this morning in the mitigation work group too, is that I think it's not difficult to conclude that in a shortage that the Central Arizona ag pool is going to be reduced, and as many people know that under the water settlements, it is the responsibility of CWCD to pay for fixed O&M for those ag pool deliveries, and they will be less under a shortage. Although pending the outcome of this whole DCP discussion, we would expect that there would be some mitigation water delivered to the ag pool even in shortage. Once taking all that into account, that my expectation is we will have a lower need for property tax money to support our obligation to the ag pool for fixed OM&R. So I have become more comfortable with the idea of repurposing some of that unused tax money. There's plenty of other uses for it, but to DCP. Obviously, that would be a decision of the CWCD board. It's not my decision. I can make a decision to recommend that to them. And as I said, I'm feeling comfortable doing that. In that, I think my decision to do that and their decision to approve it would be based on this whole program working out and being a reasonable thing. But I did want to mention too, is I'm not springing this surprise. I've got at least 5 board members here today and probably more watching. So I didn't want to spring that on them. So I've at least announced my intention to bring this up with them, not asking them for their approval in advance or anything like that. But this can be a piece of solving this puzzle if other steps are taken in conjunction with that. That's a question, Hunter?
Just a comment. For those who know a little bit about what Tom's proposed, he's not doing that in a vacuum. He's a very intelligent water director, and he's made sure to conduct some discussions with our office to make sure that we know about the idea. We've had a conversation or 2 about it, and we'd like to explore those options in the future.
Before we move to the next slide, I would like to just emphasize a couple of things here. So this, what Tom just went through on this last slide, are conclusions that we have drawn, Tom and I and our staff in these discussions that we've had in these multiple smaller group meetings over the last couple of weeks. And we call them guiding principles or proposed guiding principles. These are things we need to keep in mind as we are moving this conversation forward. Two in particular I'd like to emphasize here as we move on to the next slides. One of them is this concept here that sharing LBDCP impacts requires mitigation volumes that we've been discussing for over 2 months to be less than full mitigation. Now, full mitigation, recall, was a concept that describes acre foot per acre foot mitigation for the difference between impacts under the 2007 guidelines and the drought contingency plans. And specifically, that conversation started with respect to the ag pool, but then expanded into other pools that would be shorted under LBDCP. Why volumes needed to be less than full mitigation? Because we were having an increasing level of difficulty to amass a longer list of possible water supplies that many of which will cost money, that would exceed the budget that we've identified up here, which we think is achievable. Challenging but achievable is what I described at the earlier meeting. And also having a lot of other complexities attached to some of the potential tools, including legislative changes, contractual modifications, things like that. Not necessarily bad, but too many of those things. And the guiding principles for this group was we had agreed that too many of those things, or maybe any at all, would kind of bog down this whole process in trying to get a joint resolution through the legislature.
So before we move off the principles, any folks who have been involved in our discussions and we synthesize those into these principles want to weigh in on these at all? Okay, thanks. Oh, Governor Lewis. First, Representative Bowers, microphone on.
Thank you, Ted and Tom. And this is a continuation of we've been meeting this morning, and I listened very carefully, this morning about the circumstance for Pinal Ag and the impact that the partial mitigation plan might have on them. Over lunch, in discussing this with our team, we came to the conclusion that it's unfair to expect them to bear the brunt of the DCP cuts. Therefore, the position that myself and Councilman Dixon, my alternate, will be bringing back to the council, our council on Friday, is that CAP Ag and particularly Pinal Ag should not bear any of the reductions above and beyond what the guidelines would otherwise impose. Full mitigation of the impact of DCP on them should be our goal in our efforts here, and that is what I'm going to be advocating, bringing back to my council as the position that we should adopt. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor. Representative Bowers, did you have a comment?
I got ahead of looking at the next slides.
Oh, okay. And I appreciate those comments, Governor. I think maybe we can put those comments in context to actual numbers as we get into the next page or two. The other point that I wanted to make here that was really impactful to where we're going in the next slides was this point right here, is that for all the reasons that Tom gave, as far as the use of CAP-ICS that's already in Lake Mead, either validated or pending validation by the Bureau, lots of very strong feedback about leave that in the lake, don't use that except possibly under extreme circumstances for mitigation. That, of course, will create a need to identify and fund other sources of mitigation water that would essentially, I don't want to say replace that ICS, but substitute for its use in some way. Those two bullets are the things really that influence a lot of what you're about to see. The most. All of these things did, but those things did the most. So those of you who are participants in the mitigation work group and also in the report outs in the steering committee, that there was a decision tree that showed there were several decisions that we needed to work through in order to come up with a mitigation recommendation out of the work group to this committee. That is not what is occurring today. I think there is still a discussion going on within the work group. We haven't identified when it needs to meet next, but there's more work to be done there. But so far, and this proposal is not a proposal coming out of the work group. It is a proposal that ADWR and CWCD made jointly to the work group this morning based on our attempt to consider all of the things and many more that you saw on the previous slide to try and put together a program that worked. And following those two primary concepts of a mitigation program that is only partial mitigation, and also a mitigation program that does not use the CAP ICS supply in Lake Mead, except possibly as a safety net. In other words, it's there if the other things that we're trying aren't available or don't work. Where we ended up was a partial mitigation plan only for the Central Arizona Ag Pool. So that would be getting in a little bit into the details of Pinal districts, Harquahala, Valley Irrigation and Drainage District, and Queen Creek were the only ones outside of Pinal AMA that indicated a need for mitigation. The numbers, and it would be a fixed program, so that's the first question. Annual or fixed program? A fixed program, that's the recommendation or proposal actually. That would include those three areas that I indicated a moment ago. That the partial mitigation for the ag pool would be 595,000 acre feet through 2026. It's not flat. We'll have a table in a couple of pages that describes what that is. And that mitigation to NIA and CAGRD or developers would not be included in this program at this time. Although, as we'll get into, there are other supplies of water available if additional resources and money are available to develop beyond the 595 that is shown there that would be needed for the partial ag mitigation pool. As we discussed on the last slide, that ADWR, CWCD, with help from others, propose a $85 to $100 mitigation budget, and we'll get into on the next slide or two what that would be needed for. Tom and I discussed at least a portion of that budget, not all of it, that might be able to be identified from our two agencies under various conditions and with certain approvals. There would be voluntary limited waivers for ag mitigation that we've just discussed. System conservation, which would be creating conserved water and leaving it in Lake Mead in addition to what Arizona's reduction quantity was. And also creation and recovery of ICS would also require voluntary limited waivers. So we're using this careful wording here of voluntary and limited waivers, but they would be required to make this whole thing work by the highest priority pool that would be shorted in a Tier 1 or Tier 2 shortage would be the non-Indian ag pool. In order to allow any of those three things to happen, conserved water to flow to the ag pool for mitigation, conserved water to stay in Lake Mead for system conservation above Arizona's reduction under DCP, or the creation and recovery of ICS, all of those would need, in order to get to their intended destination, a voluntary waiver by the NIA pool participants. We say limited because the requested waiver would only be for that additional created conservation for those purposes, not the rest of the NIA pool water that would be available in that year, even under shortage. The concept here is that CWCD would only use, would use its Lake Pleasant water. There's only about 50,000 acre feet there. It's not renewable. Although there might be sometime in the future that something would occur, and we'd have to probably have a plan for that, but it's not something that could be necessarily pledged to this in advance because we don't know how much it is or when it would occur. CWCD would only use its CAP ICS as a safety net supply. In other words, if we have a plan, here's how we're going to deliver these quantities of mitigation and something didn't work out or was having a problem, that other supply would be there as a backstop that would be used if necessary. And then an ongoing discussion and work among the CAP, M&I subcontractors, and others to explore voluntary USF to GSF concepts working with ADWR, CWCD, and the Water Banking Authority. This hopefully will make more sense as we get to the next couple of slides, and some of this will come back to you. This is a slide that you've seen before that has various what we're calling mitigation tools, possible supplies of water, some of which exist, some of which could be developed that could be used for mitigation. It's a little bit simplified and a little bit more refined based on the discussions that we've had. It's a total amount of about 970,000 acre feet that would be available during Tier 1 and Tier 2 shortage. And you see some TBDs on there, and even the ones that don't have a TBD that have a range, those are being further refined by additional discussions. I'll run through them really quickly here again because it's been a couple of weeks. Lake Pleasant water, I mentioned that a moment ago. This is an accumulation of water in Lake Pleasant from basically the noise in the system of the lake being used for regulatory storage and going up and down every year. It doesn't always end up back at the same spot, and we're a little bit ahead of that. Right now, that is the supply that could be used. Compensated conservation for mitigation, the second line, this is a higher number. It used to be 350,000 acre feet, and now we've got this range in here that needs to be higher than what we've talked about before, because again, at the bottom of the list there is the CAP ICS that we're endeavoring not to use. So we need more of everything else to be able to do that. Our estimate for the budget that would be required to fund that compensated conservation is $85 to $100 million. That's based on the historical cost for that type of thing and a little bit of escalation because it will go out for 7 years. That is basically a conservation for money program. We've done a lot of those in the last 5 years. It's pretty straightforward as far as usually no other accommodations need to be made to do that as far as legislative change or contractual modifications or anything like that. New ICS. Now, we've had numbers on this slide before for new ICS that maybe a portion of what might be created under the Arizona ICS program during shortage might be available for mitigation, but as we've been discussing this, it's becoming less and less likely that if new ICS was created, it would be done for this purpose, for mitigation. It would be done for something else, if at all. And there are easier ways to provide conserved water for mitigation than putting it in the lake and taking it back out. And as Tom mentioned, even if that was done, and let's say ICS was created for a particular purpose and that didn't work out, and the owner of that decided, well, let's take it out of the lake, that would be a very difficult decision to make in the face of these declining levels in the lake. The next item there are USF to GSF. There's lots of different ways that could be done. One of the central mechanisms that's been identified because a fundamental issue with USF to GSF transaction, and just to remind everybody what that is to get wet water to Pinal Ag, this would require folks, M&I subcontractors, maybe Indian tribes that are storing water in a USF in the Phoenix or Tucson AMAs would instead send that water to a GSF in Pinal and contribute to ag mitigation. The problem with that is that there's lots of Pinal long-term storage credits already. They're not worth as much to those entities as storing water in a USF in their own AMA, and so there would need to be some kind of mitigation. And most folks have made clear that they don't want money to do that. They want the credit in the place that they need it. So they want, as Tom put it, they want their water back. And one of the mechanisms that could make that work would be if there were some credits owned by other people in those other AMAs that they may be willing to exchange them for the long-term storage credit in Pinal AMA that would be created by that transfer of water to the Pinal GSF. Those people making that donation might themselves want money for those credits. So it's pretty complex. There are lots of other mechanisms that have been identified here. And as we'll see in a moment, we've actually identified a quantity at the low end that we think will be fairly straightforward, or at least more straightforward than other ways to do some of that. Next, groundwater development and infrastructure. This originally came up as a potential opportunity for federal funding that would require some local matching, and that's the number shown off to the side there, that might allow the Pinal Ag districts to accelerate their transition from surface water to groundwater sooner than they otherwise would have had to if without DCP and without shortage. We had not put quantities for water there before because the ag folks were considering recovered groundwater as a different type of supply for various technical reasons from surface water, Colorado River surface water, but now we've put a quantity on here. And then last but not least, we talked about this a lot, CAP, ICS, it's there if we need it, but our goal is to try and develop these other things first and in sufficient quantity to not have to do that at all, if at all possible. Total potential supply that we've identified, there may be more if there's more money to do more than this, but 970,000 acre feet. Put that in context with what you saw on the previous slide of ag mitigation, partial ag mitigation of 595,000 acre feet. So there is still more water supply, most of which is this, more water supply that could be developed, probably more of this and more of this or this than what's been counted so far, that might be available for other people to do other things, including the two that we've mentioned, system conservation in the lake to protect 1050 and or some kind of mitigation program for the other pools besides the ag pool. Any questions on this before we move to the next?
Yeah, Ted, I was wondering if I could have my attorney ask a couple of questions just to clarify about this proposal.
Of course.
Thank you.
It might be easier if I step back here. I want to go back to your slide that said...
Don, can you sit at that chair and use the microphone, please, so people in the back can hear? Thanks.
Is that better? Great. Can you go back to the slide that says partial mitigation at 595? Great. And maybe Chuck can help answer these questions just to make sure I've got the circumstances correct on this so we understand what that means. So I think we all agree, and the governor stated it, that the position he's going to advocate to the council on Friday is that the Pinal Ag should not be put in a position that's worse under DCP than they would be under the guidelines. And I think that's a cardinal principle that we started to work from. And I think what I'm trying to dial into here is where would they have been under the guidelines and how we got to the 595. So I guess the first question I would have is, in 2019, based on the 2019 orders, how much ag pool would be available for delivery in 2019?
I'm going to answer your question with a little background. So first of all, let me say the 2019 orders that you're referring to are about a week old. So we've had that data for a little bit more than a week. Prior to the time that the 2019 orders have been available, we've been using historical data through 2018, an average of the past several years. And when the ag mitigation discussion began, the definition of full mitigation, the difference between what impacts would be under the guidelines and what impacts would be under the DCP was in a Tier 1, 150,000 acre feet for the non-Indian ag pool, I'm sorry, the agricultural pool, the ag settlement pool in all 3 AMAs, and 60,000 acre feet in a Tier 2. In subsequent discussions, that the need for mitigation in all 3 AMAs was narrowed down to, as I mentioned earlier, just Pinal County, Queen Creek, and HVIDD to 120,000 in a Tier 1 and 45,000 in a Tier 2. And some of you may remember that there was some statistical averaging of that into a smoother line that averaged somewhere around 90,000 acre feet or so per year. It's a little higher in the front and a little lower in the back. And so that was the evolution of the concept of what full mitigation was up until the last steering committee meeting 2 weeks ago. Subsequent to that period of time, and so the 2015, 16, 17, and 18 available supply for delivery and water orders were consistent with that scenario. In 2019, the higher priority water users are higher, and those water users are entitled to order that. And so what that does, the height of the whole water supply, available for delivery is still the same, but more water is being ordered by higher priority users, and so the non-Indian ag pool and the ag pool move up in the priority stack. And so, to answer your question, Mr. Pongrace, the quantity of water that would be available to the ag pool in 2019, if there was a Tier 1 shortage, would be around 80,000 acre feet. That's our estimate.
And would you expect that that would continue decreasing in future years based on the conversations I had with Chuck? He thought that it might actually decline a bit year on year, but even if it stayed steady, it is what it is, right?
It may. I mean, we have to recognize that there's a trend of increases in water orders by higher priority CAP contractors and subcontractors for the last several years, mostly for GSF and USF is what's driving that.
And it could go up under the guidelines as well, depending if we're in shortage, if there's more.
It could change.
Yeah.
Let's just say it could change because we don't know. The information on 2019 is relatively new. It's certainly within the range of what we could have predicted a month ago or a year ago, but next year will be likely different.
And what happens under a Tier 2 shortage to the ag supply?
Let's see. I think we looked in the guidelines 2 weeks ago. Looking at the guideline, I think this is the origin of the 60,000 acre foot number, which was under the guidelines. A Tier 2 shortage would reduce the ag pool to about 20% of its supply, or 60,000 acre feet, which is where the Tier 2 number came from. And under the guideline and under the DCP, ag would be eliminated, ag pool, under any shortage tier.
So wouldn't full mitigation of the difference between what would otherwise be available and DCP be a lower number than 595? And that would be full mitigation, not partial mitigation, based on actual supplies as the orders come in. It could be higher if the ag pool goes up, but it could also be lower if we're providing 100% mitigation for exactly the impact of the DCP cut on a year-by-year assessment of what occurs to the ag pool, in which case they're in no worse shape than they would be if they didn't have the DCP, but the rest of the state is.
Well, let me answer that question this way, and there are actually two pieces of question to answer there. So first of all, if we had a mitigation program that was on an annual basis, and we were in that annual process right now, based on the 2019 orders, what full mitigation would be for 2019 would be 80,000 acre feet. However, this is the rest of the answer. For the last 2.5 months, the definition of and understanding of what full mitigation means and partial mitigation means has been based on these 2 months of discussion, starting with 150, 60, going to 120 and 45, to maybe some arithmetic smoothing of that. And partial mitigation then would be anything less than 120 and 45 on average. Now, with this new information on 2019, we can have a discussion about redefining what full and partial means. And that was not part of the conversation that we had this morning, and maybe that's what we're doing right now.
Well, I think it's absolutely necessary because what we just got was probably the most brutal presentation about likelihood of a Tier 2 cut that we could possibly have. And in essence, we also learned as new information, I mean, essentially what we have for a mitigation plan is based on 2018 data, and we're looking at what 2019 and beyond goes from. And the idea of essentially putting someone in a better position because we simply were using old data than they would have been under the guidelines seems to me to be anathema to the basic premise of trying to make sure that this doesn't put someone in a better position than they would have been without DCP. And that, especially when others are going to be inevitably asked to sacrifice, I think that's the basic premise that we'll be taking back to the community to discuss, because I don't see that, and the governor can speak to this better than I can. I just think that's a very difficult sell to be able to say that the cuts that we now anticipate for NIA will be far more draconian than we ever expected when we first started this. And we're basing the mitigation plan based upon estimates of what we thought the ag pool would be to be able to come up with a fixed number that will clearly put them in a better position than they would have been without DCP.
Right. I understand your position, and I understand your arithmetic. What I want to make clear to the rest of the room here is that, and thank you very much again to Governor Lewis for his clarification for us of going to the council, what that means, and I'm asking you, Mr. Pongrace, does that mean that the recommendation of the council that the ag pool should be mitigated no less than the full mitigation for the difference between the guidelines and the DCP based on the 2019 quantity means that the ag pool should be no larger than 80,000 acre feet per year or 560,000 acre feet. Is that what that means?
I think it means that there would be an annual assessment of how much water would be available or would have been available in the ag pool, and the mitigation amount is based upon what the ag pool would have otherwise provided to them, providing 100% mitigation for the impact of DCP.
Okay, so to translate that for everyone else, and I don't mean to insult anyone, that from what was discussed this morning for those of you who were here, it is a quantity that's lower than this, and it would be an annual process rather than a fixed process. So I don't know if we consider this to be a counter proposal to understanding that this morning's discussion was just a proposal of a thing that might happen. This is a kind of a counter proposal.
I don't know that it's a counter proposal so much as essentially where we view the equities in this to come from. We'll know what the council decides to do on Friday in terms of the proposal, but in essence, I think the principle of mitigation is to mitigate, not to ameliorate. It's not to improve the situation that would otherwise have been there without the imposition of DCP, and we don't see any other way to get there because of the level of cuts that are there. So is it a counter proposal? I don't know. I haven't put it in the context of a proposal. We need to have a principle, and we've stated those before, and the principle is fairness and equity. And fairness and equity in terms of cuts would mean that no one's better off under DCP than they were before.
Paul.
Thank you. And I guess there's a couple of responses I have to this. I mean, this is a proposal clearly designed to drastically reduce the amount of Pinell Ag mitigation water. I want to, for the first 2 months of this process, we were using numbers that you all provided that did show in a Tier 2 shortage under the 2007 guidelines, there'd be that 60,000 acre feet available to the ag pool. So we based our proposals and our discussions on that and what you had in the Tier 1, and came up with a full mitigation proposal that it was 25% higher than the current proposal, which I guess is on the next slide. Now, and as I understand it, those water numbers were based on a number of years of CAP orders, from 2014 or whatever through 2018. They weren't based on a single year taken out and just focused on by itself. It was a number of years. This was what the standard water orders were. This was the result to the ag pool. This is what shortages would do, et cetera. Now, in 2019, we have, for some reason, some drastic change in these water orders that has some really devastating, potentially devastating impacts on the ag pool. We should drill down as why is that? Why were those orders made all of a sudden in 2019? And what's most of that extra water going to be used for? I think we need to drill down and see, where is that extra water that's being ordered that hasn't been ordered the last 4 and 5 years going to be used for? I think I have a pretty good idea, but we ought to drill down and investigate what that's going to happen. The end result is, if you flip to the next page and you look at this ag mitigation proposal for 2020, it may be 80,000 acre feet instead of 105 for 2020, and who knows for 2021 or 2022, but then you would go to zero the rest of the way. That would be the end result of that, and that would be the end of the agricultural economy in Pinal County. I think we already talked about this morning how difficult this proposal is and how much potential. To go ahead and reduce this substantially is essentially the end of agriculture in Pinal County. Now, if that's what we want to achieve, based on these, and I acknowledge these water supply numbers are dire, the trends are dire, and if we feel Pinal County needs to be the sacrificial lamb for that based on the rule of priorities, the legislature certainly has the ability to make that happen. But I guess I want to know why everything has changed so substantially, so suddenly, based on a single year's water orders.
Cynthia.
I would echo what Paul said. I'd like to see the water orders over the last 4 years, because I don't think they've changed as much as they didn't change this year. They changed somewhat. They didn't change that much. But I would like to see those numbers too. I think that would bear out. I think that the charts were created in 2016 or 2015 based upon those water orders. And I am with Paul. I don't understand why that information was not presented on a real-time basis, but I would encourage looking at those water orders over time, because I don't think anything drastically changed this year.
Can't answer all these questions, but what I'm doing right now with my co-chair's indulgence here is going to some slides that we presented this morning to try and illustrate some of this. I want to come back to that one. So as we discussed a moment ago, and as Cynthia just alluded to, and I think Paul mentioned a moment ago, that when this discussion began a couple of months ago, what we were using as estimates behind what would be the impacts on the pools under the guidelines and what would be used and what would the impacts be under the DCP, we used a kind of a blended water year from, correct me if I'm wrong, Patrick, 2014 through 2017, 18, something like that. Anyways, a blended water year. It was not a single year that was cherry picked to say, here's what the supply is and here's what the orders were. Is that generally the case? Patrick, Chuck?
He was outside.
Oh, Patrick was outside.
I don't think we knew that was the case.
So what's my question, Ted?
Question was when we developed the block diagram that we were using for water delivery supply available and the relative sizes of the various ordering pools at the commencement of the ag mitigation discussion was a blended year from the last several years. Is this correct?
That's correct.
Over what approximate time frame?
I would say the last 5 to 8 years.
Okay, 5 to 8 years. Okay. And so we were using this blended, but because of these type of questions about, well, can you update the information? Can we use more recent information? So one of the things, and we presented this morning, and we did not include it in this afternoon's material, but we might as well. So we took a look here at individual years, 2016, 2017, and 2018. They are very similar to each other. It's the last 3 years. And you can see there is a trend here where the quantity of water that is being ordered by the higher priority water users, which is their entitlement to do, has been increasing. Now, there's one thing when we have this one blended year, you don't see a trend in it because it's just a set of data. What we did is we superimposed on each one of these years, and what you see, one other thing that you see here that we didn't mention this morning, the size of the ag pool shrank from 400,000 acre feet to 300,000 acre feet in 2017. So that again was not blended in the single block diagram that we showed. It was with a 300,000 acre foot ag pool in it. So if we superimpose now a tier 1 shortage under the guidelines on top of 16, 17, and 18, you would see that in 2016 the ag pool would be reduced by about 75,000 acre feet. In 2017, the ag pool would have been reduced by 90,000 acre feet, and in 2018, I don't remember this number from this morning. Can you read it, Patrick?
89?
89,000 acre feet. And so there would be remaining in the ag pool in each of those years under the guidelines in a 2007 guideline shortage, 225,000 acre feet. Help me, 64,000 acre feet, and what's the number here?
162,000.
Okay, all of those are more than 150,000 acre feet that we've been assuming in the other block diagram. Likewise, then if we go to a tier 1 shortage under the DCP, and these are the two things that we're comparing when what the full mitigation quantities were defined initially, that the ag pool would be reduced almost entirely in 2016, bearing in mind that this is a 400,000 acre foot ag pool. In 2017, the ag pool would be completely reduced, and there would be some reduction to the NIA pool here. I don't have the number up there, but this is 200,000 acre feet, so that looks to be maybe...
It was about 30,000 acre feet.
30,000, okay. Looks like less than that, but maybe so. 2018, very similar to 2017, the ag pool is gone, and the NIA pool is reduced by something else. Each of these 3 years, taking into account the shrinkage of the ag pool from 16 to 17, are almost identical, very similar, if not identical, to the delivery chart that we had been using throughout this conversation since July. 2019, now I'm going to superimpose that. So you saw the trend on the earlier slide, 16, 17, 18 going up more in 2019. I'm going to unwind that a little bit to answer a question that was asked a moment ago. Now I can't find the darn thing. I'm going the wrong way, that's why. So here is a longer history of long-term contract use, and you can see some of the things we talked about a moment ago, an increase in growth in the longer term, higher priority contracts, federal down here, M&I right here, ag pool right here, and toward the end there it shrinks, and there's ag participation in conservation programs, and then most drastically of all, the other excess pool, which was taking up the slack in the unused water, which is what it's designed to do, was taking the brunt in those years of the increases in the supply. We did, not to answer it in the level of detail that you're asking for, Paul, but take a look at the change over the last 13 years in long-term storage credit accrual over that period of time. That's both GSF and USF. So yeah, incrementally, it's not a lot from year to year, but between where we were in 2014 and where we are now, it's increased by 150,000 acre feet. The incremental difference from year to year is not large, but once again, going here now, through 2018, during this last 2.5 months of discussion, the chart that we've been using accurately represents each one of those years and all those years in aggregate accurately. Now with 2019, there's a pretty marked difference here, is that, as we mentioned a moment ago, under the guidelines, a Tier 1 shortage would leave about 80,000 acre feet in the ag pool versus what was it in 2018? It was 162 or something like that. So half of the quantity in the earlier year. And a Tier 1 shortage in 2000 and under the DCP would eliminate the ag pool and would cut into the NIA pool by 112,000 acre feet versus maybe what it was 40,000 acre feet in 2018. And that is due to, you can see here a little bit of a decline of what we expect the full delivery supply to be.
Yeah, I
Something
just
to
want
add?
two comments about the block chart. So first, on the 2019 water orders, we got Reclamation's water order, who orders on behalf of the tribes yesterday at 4 o'clock. So we haven't gone through and compiled those orders, made sure they're compliant with the available contracts. As this block chart is stamped, it is draft. We're still going through the orders to see what the actual orders will be. So it's stamped draft. We're not all the way through them yet. So that's if 2019 is going to be the basis for this discussion, we need to make sure that it's right and complete. We haven't done that yet. The second point I want to make about the chart relative to the other years is the one that Ted was just making. In 2018, we did have a larger total supply as compared to 2019. We had almost 48 to 58,000 acre feet that we made available out of Pleasant. We have put out a draft number in our August 21st meeting for the CAP delivery supply, but we still need to look at that as we put together our annual operating plan. And it did not include any water being released from the lake, in part because there are conversations that are going on with this body about using some of that water for mitigation. So I think my opinion, if I have the microphone and I get 3 seconds of it, we need to look at these recent years in context, not solely cling to 2019.
Okay, so that's probably as well as we can answer those questions that have come up this morning at this time. So 2019, as presented for right now, I think we can take from Patrick's comments that 2019 at this point is preliminary. I, for one, wouldn't want to redefine what full and partial means on a very preliminary look at 2019 and say, well, that's it. That's the thing instead of this other thing that we've been doing. But it's happening for two reasons: an increase in orders down here and lower total water supply from the top because the conditions are different. Spencer had a comment. Thank you.
I had a couple comments. Number one is, these numbers are important. Everybody's trying to come up with the right numbers about what we see, the lay of the land, and I understand the current concerns that were brought up, but we've been working on these numbers for 2 months, and we're under the gun. There's a deadline involved, and I think we need to, finalize these numbers so we're all working off the same set of facts and move forward with decisions that we can or cannot make as a group so we can adopt a plan. And so from my perspective, I think this information, maybe earlier it could have been considered. I don't know, maybe we do consider it. I'm not here to make the decision, but I just want to develop the same set of facts. But what, the numbers up on the board that you showed, we've seen an increase in orders and an increase of development of long-term storage credits, and that's what I saw in those numbers, and that brings into question, where are our priorities? Are our priorities, developing long-term storage credits, which may be for some people, it may be conserving water in Lake Mead, it may be for a variety of other purposes, but it does, every decision obviously affects a multitude of other consequences, and this is demonstrated by the difficulty of trying to come to an agreement. But at the end of the day, I think we would like just a set of facts to move forward and make appropriate policy decisions about it.
Yeah, when it is, yeah. So if there are no other questions on this little detour, we can go back to the other slide. It's probably, we've been at this now for a good period of time. I doubt we're done with this conversation, but is this a good point to break? Or do you want to go back to the other slide deck and see where it was we were before we decided to do that? Break. Tom's saying break. Okay, I didn't hear anybody say no. So please, 10 minutes. Okay, everyone, what we'd like to do is pick up where we left off before we had that unplanned but I think very necessary and informative discussion on the numbers. So I'd like to go back to the slide that we were on when all of that started and back into the framework of the decision tree that we proposed at the beginning of the mitigation discussion of the decisions that needed to be made, and put that in the context of this proposal. And I'll put maybe several sets of quotes around that word proposal that was discussed this morning and further this afternoon. We didn't actually make all the way through it. Fixed versus annual, the proposal was fixed. In other words, we would identify what the mitigation quantities would be in advance, and then we would stick to those. We would do our best to identify the individual quantities that would contribute to that mitigation. That would it be all three AMAs, or would it be some subset of that? And a couple of meetings ago, we identified that it would be a subset of all three AMAs would be Pinal districts, Queen Creek, in Phoenix AMA, and HVIDD. Would it be full mitigation or partial mitigation? Understanding that, at least to me, the use of full and partial in the context of the conversation that we just had is somewhat fluid. But as of this morning, the numbers that we discussed were a portion of the numbers that had been discussed previous to that, and I think to most people that would represent partial mitigation compared to the previous numbers that had been characterized as full mitigation. That there was, the numbers do not include NIA mitigation or CAGRD and developer impacts, although that requires further discussion and expression of interest, funding, etc. As I pointed out on the next slide that we showed, which is these quantities, the proposed ag pool mitigation would not use up all of the identified supplies that we had estimated. Support for water and funding, I won't go over that again, but we believe that this is the size of budget that would be necessary to develop this level of compensated conservation for mitigation and maybe matching funds for infrastructure development. That the plan includes the use of Lake Pleasant for mitigation, but that makes every attempt to avoid using the CAP-ICS supply except as a safety net. That doesn't say it on this page, but yeah, it does. Voluntary limited waivers would be necessary to make this program work in addition to system conservation, which again is leaving more water than Arizona is required to conserve or to reduce in a DCP shortage and ICS, and that we need to do more work on starting with USF, GSF. We think that's the most viable one. So what we didn't get to, so there again is a list of the supplies under consideration. Here's a summary of the mitigation proposal that was floated this morning. It still needs to be discussed some more, obviously. I'm going the wrong way. Here are we didn't really get to this. Here would be the fixed schedule mitigation under this morning's proposal only, ag mitigation. 105 for 3 years, 70 for 4 years, 595 total. That's about a 25% reduction from the smoothed mitigation plan from last time that was based on 120 in a Tier 1 and 60 in a Tier 2. David has a question. Okay.
Thank you. I just wanted to go back to the mitigation proposal slide. If you're looking for expressions of interest for GRD or developer mitigation, we're here to express support for that. Obviously, we've talked about the importance of a plan that considers economic development, and we obviously think the GRD is essential to future economic development in the state of Arizona. We weren't happy with the original number that was put in there of 7. We had been asking for something higher, closer to 30. We understand that everybody's going to give in this process, so we're certainly open to what that number is, but we would like to see that put back on the board.
Thank you. Okay, so what we wanted to show to kind of wrap up this section of today's discussion as much as we can was 2 scenarios to illustrate how this mitigation schedule could be implemented. So scenario 1 is a combination of compensated conservation for mitigation. It's at the lower end of the range, 420,000 acre feet, and that would probably cost somewhere around $80 million or more to do. The Lake Pleasant water, and then a portion of CAP-ICS. I know folks don't like that, but if that's all the supplies that we have, this is kind of what we're left with. Something that I think people will like a lot more is what's on this page, which includes now the 3 that were on the other one, which was mitigated system conservation, Lake Pleasant water, almost no CAP-ICS, and why is that? It's because USF to GSF at 25K per year has been included on this slide. We think that that's achievable with using some of the simpler USF to GSF mechanisms that have been identified so far. And then you'll note out here, after the step down in the mitigation schedule, there is actually a larger supply than is necessary for this mitigation program, and that could be deployed to other purposes. The thing that we've labeled out here is maybe system conservation. Leave it in Lake Mead to help prop the lake up when the probability of 1050 and below is even higher than it is today, or NIA mitigation or what have you. And of course, there are other supplies on that earlier slide that don't show up on here at all that could be either replace these and make them available for something else, or augment these and be available for those other programs. So those are just 2 examples. So we believe that sufficient supplies and funding are available to achieve the ag mitigation target as proposed here this morning. If that target changes, if it increases, or that mitigation for other pools is added to that, well, then we need to get back to what supplies and what funding is available, and how do we share that. CAP-ICS, I think we've done. We've heard what people are saying and tried to come up with the scenarios that preserve as much as possible the CAP-ICS for later, leave it in the lake. And as we said many times already this afternoon, there's a potential for system conservation or that's a third bullet, or mitigation for other pools through further tool development and additional funding. Brian.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you don't mind, Governor Lewis, you made a statement earlier about NIA mitigation in the earlier meeting. Is that, just for clarification purposes, is that still your intent on the NIA mitigation as well?
Yes, that is. NIA is not protected at all under this, and that's a very much a concern. The community, just with the information we got today, we're going to be taking massive cuts, is what my team is calculating right now. So this plays into NIA. That would have a drastic effect on the community's water supplies. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Questions on this? Yeah, before we move on, Tim.
Just a comment, repeating a comment from earlier this morning. Wanted to, even though it looks like there's going to be continued discussion about what the mitigation volume could or should be, under scenario 2, just wanted to reiterate support for the concept of USF to GSF. There's real water there that can be made available. It's definitely one of the preferred options for mitigation of whatever volume, and it certainly, in Tucson's view, and I think shared by many of the cities, a superior option to the use of CAP ICS. So I like what I saw under scenario 2, where that was just a safety net as opposed to the primary supply.
Thank you. Okay. We're going to move now to the other topic, ICS, and of course we're not done with this, so it's not over. And Tom and I will be discussing with each other next steps on this, and then coming back to you all, of course, as our steering committee. So Arizona ICS framework. Suzanne, I'm taking the training wheels off here because you did an excellent job this morning, and I listened to you. So I'm going to take this piece, if you don't mind. Somebody's got their mic on, and we're getting feedback. No? There we go. Thank you. So the Arizona ICS framework. We've discussed this at earlier meetings. I need to make sure. Okay. At earlier meetings about the development of a framework and a framework agreement among CAWCD, ADWR, and Bureau of Reclamation. That would be a framework agreement. But the overall approach in developing that framework, it would be a way to include CAWCD, as a reminder, is the only Arizona Section 5 contractor that has created ICS so far, even though other folks have the right to do that. We need to make sure the program that we design continues to have space for other on-river contractors to participate, include them, non-tribal on-river users, and now CAP settlement tribes to create and deliver ICS. As is the secret formula for lots of successful agreements, is to develop agreements that avoid legal disputes, particularly ones that have derailed ICS discussions in the past, and in doing so preserve the individual parties and participants' key legal arguments in order to achieve compromise and a collaborative solution. Share capacity in practical and meaningful ways with lots of flexibility, I might add, and we've been through the details of that in the work group earlier and reported it out here. Avoid unintended consequences, and as you'll see, a lot of the way that is addressed is by frequent consultation and discussion among all the parties. After we get this thing going, need to make sure we're touching base often to make sure that we're all aware of what everyone else is doing. And then, again, as we mentioned before, concurrence through voluntary limited waivers by CAP NIA contractors and subcontractors, and in the case of ICS, also by CWCD, to not order that water that is being created or recovered under the ICS program. So this framework agreement that would kind of set the overall terms. The parties, we've said this all before, United States, ADWR, and CWCD, to develop the program that we described on the earlier page for those participants to create and accumulate and to deliver ICS in Arizona. pursuant to the 2007 guidelines and the Lower Basin Drought Contingency Plan. The term for creation would be coterminous with the guidelines, December 31st, 2026. When I look at that date, it makes me think of like the last century. I don't know why, but it does. And then the remaining provisions for recovery and delivery of ICS would extend beyond 2026 to the extent that there were still ICS in the accounts after the termination of the guidelines. Potential ICS creators, again, mentioned this a moment ago, CWCD, on-river contractors, on-river tribes, and also CAP settlement tribes. We recently completed a first draft to incorporate many of the concepts that we've discussed at earlier steering committee meetings as developed in the ICS work group, and presented a draft of that. We've developed that collaboratively between ADWR, CWCD, and the Bureau of Reclamation. We shared a draft of that agreement with key interested tribal entities just last Friday. They haven't had a lot of time to look at it. We've got a few comments back so far, but that process needs to continue. But here is, on the next few slides, a kind of a digest of what is included in that agreement. And a lot of this you've seen before. Cooperative use of the annual EC-ICS creation limit. That limit for Arizona is 100,000 acre-feet. It does not change under DCP. And as reported earlier, we proposed a 50-50 split between tribal and non-tribal ICS creators. 50,000 acre-feet per year. That's renewable. Once a year is over, you start over again. That creation is authorized when Lake Mead is above 1025, and the parties and the creators, the parties meaning ADWR, CWCD, and the Bureau, and the creators would discuss the advisability below 1025 if Lake Mead is projected to be at or below 1030 within the next 2 years. And by the way, these conditions here mimic what is in the DCP itself for reconsultation for what do we do next. So right now, at least at the levels that we're at right now, creation would be authorized down to 1025, but when we see 1030 on the horizon, we will discuss maybe we ought to consider whether or not we ought to do ICS below 1025. Use of the annual creation capacity authorized, this 50-50 split between tribal and non-tribal would be able to be shared. So if one group or another was not able to use all of their capacity in a given year, that would be available to the other group. And there are provisions in the agreement about when that notice would have to take place and be part of this annual meet and confer process that we put together. The cooperative use of so the second key feature, cooperative use of the total accumulation limit. Arizona currently has an accumulation limit of 300,000 acre-feet, pending validation by the Bureau of Reclamation that is expected to be full by the end of 2019. It will be increased to 500,000 acre-feet under the DCP, and there may be an additional 100,000 acre-feet, in other words, 600,000 total, available under a pending agreement that is being discussed between California, Nevada, and Arizona on a loan from those two states to Arizona. And that was I think we discussed that a little bit last time, part of some additional tools and flexibility under the DCP itself that would allow this kind of interstate capacity lending and borrowing, and also the ability that's not listed on here of any state to make a contribution on behalf of another state. And then continued cooperative use of the accumulation limit. That too would be split 50-50. So assuming the increase in the limit from 300,000 to 500,000 acre-feet, that would be 250,000 each for tribal and non-tribal. I mentioned a moment ago that under the programs that are in place right now, we would expect that the CAP-created ICS might be 300,000 or more by the end of 2019. So how do you get back to 250 if you need to? In other words, if the tribal participants fill up what is available, and the non-tribal parties, CWCD for instance, is occupying part of that space. If that happens, provided that a tribal ICS creator needs the accumulation space that's being occupied by the other party, non-tribal party, provide notice for no less than 12 months. I like the way Suzanne put that this morning. And CWCD shall evacuate the amount of accumulation space necessary to accommodate that creation. It's important to emphasize here, though, that if we go from 300 and it's full to 500, there's nearly 200,000 acre feet to fill up first before we have to deal with this evacuation concept. But it's an important thing to have. We can share it as long as when the other party wants it, you get out of the way and allow them to use that. CWCD would also agree not to convert ICS that's occupying the accumulation space ascribed to tribal ICS creators to DCP ICS. So to the extent that we have ICS that is occupying tribal space, in order to be able to do this evacuation, we need to make sure we do not and agree not to convert it to DCP ICS, because then it must stay there until 11/10 and we would be unable to evacuate it. So these are some of the details that are spelled out in that agreement. And last but not least, cooperative use of the Arizona annual ICS delivery limit. It's 300,000 acre feet. It doesn't change under DCP. It's a lot bigger number than the creation limit, 3 times as big, so you can take water out faster than you can put in. I, for one, worry about that we don't want to undo what's carefully been done over a period of time. So on this one, that would be split 50-50, 150 each for tribal and non-tribal parties. And we would meet and confer every year about what our plans are to use that capacity. It would be, I'm going down to here, it would be shared, similar to the accumulation capacity if a portion of it is unused by one party or another. Between 1025 and 1045, conversion of ECICS to DCP ICS counts as a delivery. We have to remember that. And that, last but not least, delivery of ICS to tribal and non-tribal creators will be pursuant to separate delivery agreements with the United States. So there will be this framework agreement among ADWR, CWCD, and the Bureau of Reclamation, and there will be separate delivery agreements between the United States and each tribal participant. Key terms continued. ADWR and CWCD will coordinate with non-tribal on-river contractors to determine their interests. We've already met with them once in participating in the Arizona ICS program, and to discuss how sharing of the creation, accumulation, and delivery capacity in the non-tribal share would be further shared. And a lot of that would be part of this annual meet and confer process. We just want to make sure that although no other on-river contractors other than CWCD have utilized ICS to date, that in the future some might want to, and there needs to be a space for them to participate if that need comes up later. The U.S. will need to consult with the tribal ICS creators to determine how to share the tribal share of the capacity. And then I've mentioned this many times. You can see how important it is that there will be annual coordination among the 3 framework agreement parties and all the ICS creators to confer on what the plans are for the next year, to make sure there's no unintended consequences and we're not interfering with each other in trying to maximize the utility of this tool. What do we need to do going forward? Complete the Arizona ICS framework agreement, and also do some work on preparing exhibits for ICS creation. You may remember that we've discussed earlier that the finalization and approval of the DCP in the interstate process will include concurrent approval of all pending and new ICS exhibits that are ready at the time that is done here, later this year, early next year time frame. So we need to get to work in putting as many of those together as we can for defined programs that we that we anticipate or can conceive of and get most of those under that wire as we can. It doesn't mean we won't be able to do more later, but clearly getting on that train while it's leaving the station is a good idea. The one-off ones later is a little bit more of an effort to get done. And that those discussions would involve all these same parties that are involved in everything else that we've talked about up to this point. One thing that we would like to report out here on ICS is that even though we're not done, that the ICS framework work group participants this morning agreed that our work as a work group was completed and that we're turning over the remainder of fleshing that program out back to the steering committee. So that in I think 4 meetings, the tribal ICS work group that grew into a broader discussion has completed its work, and that's well on its way, and it's now in the hands of the steering committee. So congratulations and thank you to all the participants in that process. Half of you are them, so give yourselves a hand. Anything else, Tom?
So let me add to what Ted just said in a little bit more detail. So the Arizona framework agreements are being worked on. We're very close to having those done. What the work group talked about this morning was the path forward being to get the documents to all of you in time for you to analyze them and have questions prepared for the October 25th steering committee meeting in a way that we could then walk out of that meeting with this completely done, including agreement to every word on the paper for those agreements. So I think unless there's folks on the steering committee that see a problem with that, I think that's the best way for us to proceed. Before we ask for more delegate comments, there was one really important question that came up among many important questions on this issue this morning that I wanted to relay to you, and that the question was, would this ICS program allow marketing of Arizona water out of the state? And the answer is no. And again, kind of conceptually and consistent with one of our proposed principles, i.e. Making sure that we honor Indian water settlements and folks' contracts. So the concept is if you have a right to market your water or move your water outside your contract service area for your Colorado River water that you would use in your service area, if you have that right to move it out, you can move this ICS out. And we'll let the lawyers worry about all the words, and if you do not have that right, you will not be able to do so. So when we all have a chance to look at the documents, hopefully you will see that the answer to that question is unequivocally no. The water needs to stay within Arizona. So with that, I'll ask for other comments from steering committee members around the table. Brian first, then Stephanie.
I'd just like to say for the ag mitigation numbers that I myself kind of feel a little uneasy about them if those are the only surface water supplies that's going to be provided to Pinal. Paul mentioned earlier that with only those numbers that they're looking about 45% of the farmland that can't be farmed anymore because it doesn't have enough surface water supply, and that I would hope the current GSF partners for Pinal continue to send GSF water their way above what is also put down for the ag mitigation.
Stephanie.
Thank you, Chairman Bushetsky. So I haven't taken much time of the committee's time during the delegate comments, and so I'm going to take a few minutes today. I don't know if I'll have another opportunity to make some of these comments. I find it's ironic that in 2018, we're exactly 150 years from the first farmer starting with a settlement in the Phoenix area, planting wheat, barley, and corn. There wasn't anybody else here. There was relics of past tribal farming, but he was pretty much the starter. His name was Jack Swilling. It's very easy to dismiss agriculture in a day when you have as much food as you could possibly want, and it's less expensive than anywhere else in the world. And it's very easy to dismiss agriculture, it seems like, if we just focus on Pinal agriculture and the situation that we now find ourselves in. But agriculture and mining are the only primary sectors of the of the economy in this state. They form the base and the foundation of where we are today and where we started from. And they will be important and relevant no matter what happens and where we go in the future. As I said before, agriculture is a $23 billion industry in the state of Arizona. Going back to Jack Swilling and his farm, pulling Salt River water off to water his fields, 2 years later there were 200 people in this area right outside of where we sit, farming 1,500 irrigated acres in and around that original farm. Tempe arose shortly after that with the building of the Kirkland, McKinney, and San Francisco irrigation districts. Mesa was settled by what are described as expert agriculturalists and irrigators. These were Mormon pioneers coming down from Idaho and Utah. This agricultural growth led to many other canals and water delivery infrastructures, as well as major travel routes. So not only did these farmers begin the access to the water which we all share today, but they also began the infrastructure, the travel infrastructure. Grand Avenue was built as a route for agricultural marketing. The existence of Grand Avenue led to the siting of Peoria and Glendale. The farmers that existed here cobbled together enough capital to bring the rail line to Tempe and Phoenix. A vet and a self-learned irrigation engineer, who some of you have heard of, Alexander Chandler, began the thought process in Arizona of tracking snowfall and creating water storage facilities to better manage the droughts and floods, which were known to wreak havoc on farmers, and they would leave and go somewhere else. This, of course, was the beginning of the thought process for the Salt River Project and the Roosevelt Dam. Farmers have brought ingenuity, sacrifice, and investment to central Arizona for 150 years. Arizona is a mid-latitude warm climate. So what does that mean? That means that we can grow almost anything here for the entire year. The only other climates that can claim this type of growth are Mediterranean climates, and there's only 5 of them that exist on the planet. By 2015, the farmers in this country have been told that we have to increase production by 70% on likely less arable land available to us to keep up with population growth. That means that the climate that exists in Arizona, a warm, mild climate, where we can grow year-round and almost anything you can think of, will be extremely valuable in the future. The loss of CAP water to the farmers in central Arizona is not only a loss to the farmers and the local economies, but a great loss to the livestock sector in the entire state of Arizona, which is the largest agricultural sector in the state of Arizona. It's a loss to the families of rural communities who depend upon this economic growth and funding for their schools. It's a loss to all of the Arizona families who value locally grown food and fiber. Pinal agriculture alone accounts for 25% of the agricultural sales in Arizona, and if you pair that with Maricopa, it's over 50% of agricultural sales. And if you pair that with Yuma, it's over 75% of what we produce in this country, in this state. I believe that the people of Arizona value and respect local food production, and they understand that water for food and fiber is not mutually exclusive to water for drinking. It is a shared resource of which the consumer benefits twice, when we put it into the ground and grow their food and when they drink it out of their tap. Is what Pinal agriculture, and really all of agriculture in Arizona, asking for unreasonable? For the good or the bad, agriculture water is the currency for the water policy in Arizona and has been for decades. We are the currency. We are where people go for water when they need it, and we have always been engaged and willing to talk. Sometimes this was voluntarily to improve access, reliability, and really lower the costs for everyone. And sometimes it was forcefully to resolve decades-old disputes. But one thing's for sure, growth, infrastructure, certainty, and settlements would not be possible in this state without the water coming from farmers. In the 1980s, farmers committed to and invested in greater on-farm efficiencies and created best management practices during that struggle. In 2004, negotiations between municipalities, industry, agriculture, and tribes culminated in a promise to the farmers of Pinal County. In exchange for relinquishing CAP subcontract rights, they would have security in a certain amount of water for a certain amount of time for an affordable price. We know the circumstances by which that agreement was made and benefited everyone who was involved in that agreement have drastically changed. However, the reaction to this change in circumstances will be direct harm and sole harm to these farmers who engaged in the first place to help the situation be better. Is it unreasonable to ask that excess water, which has already been stored by these farmers, be available in a time of need and emergency? Or that a very small percentage of intentionally created surplus be available to mitigate grower shortages as practicable and sensible? Obviously, it wouldn't be sensible if we are on the line. Is it unreasonable to ask that water currently being stored and unavailable for direct use be temporarily diverted to farmers in a time of shortage? Even with these acts of mitigation, only half, and now we heard this morning, even less of that promise to these farmers will be kept, and many at a cost that some of them will not be able to even afford. We are asking to mitigate for a promise that will not be kept, a promise which initiated over $750 million in farmer investment since that promise was made. We know the technology will continue to advance water conservation and treatment, while policies will adjust to these new technologies, whether that's desalting or whatever else we come up with. However, the rush to hoard water completely ignores these future advances and will seal the fate of food production. Once an acre of farmland is covered by pavement and concrete, it never comes back. Arizona would not exist as it does today without the contributions of farmers for 150 years, without the investment and drawdown of this agricultural currency. We sit here around these tables for the last 2 months as leaders and representatives of what makes Arizona, Arizona. What is the message that we send to the farmers of Mojave County, Cochise County, Graham County, and anywhere else in the state of Arizona if we are unwilling to even temporarily share in a shortage? What is the message that we send to all of the growers in this state? Farmers have provided certainty to this state, yet when the tables have been turned, the rug has been pulled out from under us, and it just was again about 25 minutes ago. Agriculture in its entirety is important to the people of Arizona, and I would dare to say to the entire nation. Our ask is temporary, and it's perfectly reasonable. Pinal agriculture needs certainty, not an annual assessment. Arizona agriculture needs certainty, not a group of some of the most foremost leaders in the state being able to figure out mitigation to save an industry that is a primary industry of the state. I would like to thank Tucson and EPCOR and AMWA for their commitment for USF. I don't know if that's in addition to what we have or if that's to replace something, but at least it's productive and it's not obstructive. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. So at one point in my life, I wanted to be a history major. And when you work in water, you have to know history as well. So it was great to hear that recitation of the development in Phoenix, my former employee, and I'm pretty up to speed on how that all happened and the benefit that created to Phoenix as a successor and interest to that water that Swilling started putting on land and other farmers came. And I actually have land with a Kent Decree water right that was formerly ag land. Not a great date, though. But I feel compelled to point out as well that I've read historical accounts from military folks, 1848, U.S. Army coming here, Mexican War being fed by Gila River Indian Community to Pimas, people on their way to California in the gold rush, again, going through Maricopa wells being fed by Pimas. So they're an important part of our history, too, in terms of agriculture. And I think where we all need to be is putting together the kind of collaborative programs we're talking about here
that, again, as we have said many times, kind of spread this pain around a little bit, and that is challenging, but I think we are still on track to end up with that outcome. So others around the table? David.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'll take a crack at it, but much shorter. So, I'm a fifth-generation farmer and rancher in Arizona. I do a little lawyering on the side, but my great-great-grandfather on my mother's side was a part of the first group into Mesa to build canals there, and then he was sent down and he founded St. David. I have a long history in watching what happened. I was sat on the steps of the courthouse in St. John's when my father was running for the legislature the first time, and he had a joint appearance with Senator Hayden. I think it was in 1962, so I was 8 years old. And I remember Senator Hayden talking about the importance of the CAP for the entire state. And he had maps that showed the various components of the CAP project that would affect Apache County and Navajo County and Coconino County, Graham County and Greenlee County, Cochise County. Of course, as things worked out, none of those promises came to fruition. So history is important. As the spokesman today for the Arizona Cattle Growers, I've said this before, we have a vested interest in what goes on in Pinal County because of the feeders that exist in Pinal County. The cattle industry in Arizona is very important for a lot of reasons, not just financially and economically, but as a legacy and as a heritage to what this state is all about. And without feeders, we really have a difficult time in the production chain. And so we have a strong desire to see Pinal County thrive in the agricultural sector. Let me just say one other thing is over the last 2 years, my good friend and associate Bass Aja has done some polling, he and some of his associates, about agriculture in the state of Arizona, and it's very interesting polling. But one of the clear messages that comes from that polling is the people in this state are willing and almost anxious to pay to support the ongoing existence of agriculture. Because I don't think, if you talk to most people, just like Stephanie says, they want to live in a state where we don't produce our own food and we don't produce our own cotton to wear. And so for that reason, we support 100% the need for Pinal County to be backstopped and to have, regardless of what scenario is chosen, even if there wasn't a DCP, we need to find as a state and have the policy to help Pinal County continue to exist in their farming. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Others? Wade.
I was at a meeting the other day, and as is usual, when people are around agriculture, they like to recite their history. You know, I was in farming for 350 years, and Representative Bowers was reciting his history about up in Apache County and all those things, and I thought, you know, I know Apache County. There aren't any Bowers up there. They're in agriculture. About 5 minutes later, I thought, oh, he's talking about my family. So we've been around agriculture a lot, and it is important to all parts of this state. But what David said about we need to figure out a way to backstop Pinal County agriculture is absolutely true. Whether it's the personal tragedies that will occur from farm failures if we don't get them the water because of the drought, or whether it's not, it impacts the other parts of the economy. Throughout the state, we've got to figure out a way to solve it. We have been up and down all day long on this particular issue, mostly down. But to hear Paul say, you know, we think we're going to have to take a much tighter haircut than we anticipated, that means they understand they're going to have to give. But it's kind of like the story about the drought in famine in China one time. They came to Wang Chin and said, you know, neighbor came and said, I got to have some rice, I'm going to die. And Wang Chin's wife said, we have a handful of rice. If we give him half of our rice, we'll die tomorrow. And her husband said, but if we don't give him half our rice, he'll die today. Now, it's not quite that dramatic or drastic for us, but we're looking at it. If we can't take care of this sector today, then we're not going to be able to take care of other sectors as we get to 1050 and 1025. That's going to happen. Some of us have enjoyed the Simon and Garfunkel song, Mrs. Robinson. Well, guess what? We can't hide it from the kids anymore. It's out. The news that we got today with regards to the likelihood of 1050 in the very near future is out there now. Not going to be able to hide it from those people who are looking at Arizona and California and Nevada, and the dramatic effects that a 1050 would have on all three of these states. It's going to happen. It's there. We're going to have to deal with it. And how we deal with drought, both protecting ourselves and protecting those around us, will mark us for the future. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Wade. Others around the table. So we'll do, sorry. Shane.
I think there's going to be a lot more discussion about a lot of the comments that were made at the next ag mitigation meeting. I can almost guarantee that. And so a lot of the comments that I have and the thoughts that I have about what's been said today, I will wait till then. I would ask the group not to forget that it's not all about Pinal County Ag. There is Maricopa County Ag and there is Pima Ag. And while we have been willing to assist, I would ask the group not to forget that there is the potential for real impact to the hydrology of Maricopa County and the hydrology of Pima County if we start scoping into where priority water should be directed outside of that priority owner's direction. We have done some great things in Maricopa County with regards to hydrology, but that's because of the partnering and the ability to allow those priority users to direct. And I want to make sure that at least for Maricopa County Ag, we recognize that if we're going to focus on Pinal County, that we do it in such a way as to not force more groundwater pumping in Maricopa County. And I'll be honest, some of what I've heard today here has the potential for doing that. Beyond that, this morning's comments, and I want to make sure that I address this, we seem to have gotten a little more factional as the day went on, as opposed to maybe where we were this morning. And a question was posed about the ethic of where potentially Arizona is headed with this effort and future planning. And I'd like to remind us all that I think it's inherent upon us to keep that in mind. As Wade has just indicated, I'm not as familiar with Simon and Garfunkel as maybe you are, but I appreciate it. But the notion being is that we inherently have a need to look beyond the factional status of where we're at on a lot of things. And I would like to think that this group moving forward is going to focus in on that. The other thing I would really like is some of these open-ended comments about, for example, not to put the home builders on the spot, but I understand, and I think a lot of folks do, that we want more than 7,000, but what is that number? We just went through a pretty hard exercise in the last hour, recognizing, I think, where the Gila River Indian community is, because we're talking about a number. So if when we come back to the next mitigation meeting, what is that number? We don't have much more time to sit around and debate. Is it 7? Is it 30? We don't have much more time to debate. Is it 105? Is it 80? And we need to get there pretty quick. And with that, I appreciate the group and what we're doing and listening to me wax on for a little longer.
Thanks. Ted?
Thanks, Tom. I want to thank Kevin Moran, who's been representing the NGO community here in these meetings, the last several meetings. But I've been with you, and at the risk of sort of demonstrating the lack of a social life, some people binge watch Game of Thrones. Well, I've been binge watching your steering committee meetings, and I want to thank you for putting them on video. But you know, I think you've made some progress, and I think a lot more progress in the working groups in particular, as sort of demonstrated today. But you're still not there, and I want to encourage the folks around the table and in the steering and working group meetings to continue to press on. I think over the last couple of days, outside of Arizona, there's been a lot of press about the drought contingency agreements that have been released, and the, you know, basically the way I think about it, about a year ago, Mexico was saying, hey, we are going to take shortages, and we'll take even greater shortages if the lower basin states will agree to take greater shortages. They signed up prospectively, not knowing if it was going to happen, but they agreed to do it, recognizing that we're in a time of limits. Nevada was quickly on board, and over the last 6 months or so, California now is on board, the U.S. federal government is on board, and the upper basin states are getting on board. And Arizona can't afford to miss this train because it's some pretty dire hydrology. And we don't control it. I think you do control what you do as water managers with this possibility of continued difficult hydrology. And it's not easy. I'm not trying to articulate that it is. But it's critical. It's critical to the future of Arizona. It's critical to the environment that depends on a healthy Colorado River Basin, and it's critical to the entire southwestern United States. And I can't urge you enough to continue to make these difficult decisions, because Mother Nature may not wait for you to make these difficult decisions in your own right. We stand ready to help. We have supported the System Conservation Program in the past. We would hope to support that program in the future, certainly if there are environmental outcomes that can be tied to that. I want to say that the level of support may not be what some folks in the room are thinking. It's different than the state of Arizona or the Central Arizona Project, but if there are ways that we can help, we intend to do what we can, and we look to help also secure federal resources that can help solve some of the problems that you're going to be facing in terms of going forward. And I point to the Farm Bill in particular that has some provisions potentially that can give the West its fair share of Farm Bill dollars that I think could help in some of the circumstances Arizona may find itself in. With that, I just want to encourage you to continue to keep your eye on the ball, and thank you.
Thanks, Ted, and thanks for that offer of support. Before we go to Sandy, I don't want to lose Wade's thread of Simon and Garfunkel, and so having grown up in New York and rooting for the Yankees over the last couple of days, I would point to the part of the song that says, "Where have you gone, Joe DiMaggio?" Sandy.
I would feel bad for you, but it's the Yankees. You know, as one of the offensive hoarders, you know, it's this conversation is difficult. I think I'm happy to see that Paul is still at the table. We had a really good conversation this morning, so I'm assuming his position of making the recommendation that he was willing to make so far hasn't resulted in his demise in his position. And I don't want to see that happen. I think
we could detail and number ourselves to death. We have committed on behalf of Freeport, we store only at agricultural facilities, including the Pinal AMA. And to the extent that we can continue to do so, we will continue to do so for as long as feasible, at a much reduced rate than even the ag price now. I don't find that bad. I don't think that, you know, that's hoarding. I think what we're trying to do is find ways to assist and continue the ag community. There are partners in many, many ways. Ag and mining have, as Stephanie correctly pointed out, have a very long history, and we want to continue that history, and we want to help continue that history for agriculture in Arizona. I was happy with the proposal this morning. I think it is a very difficult thing. I think we all have to think about what we are willing to do to get there. At the very first meeting, I remember Mr. Bowers and Mrs. Griffin talking about we're all going to have to take, they're looking for equal cuts. And so we could get into numbers over and over and over. I think having something that is consistent, something that we know going forward is better for Arizona. I think it's better for the economy of the state. We will know what's happening, but if we have to, reevaluate that every year, I understand with the lake levels that there's going to be some of that, but I think as long as we have a consistent understanding of what our haircuts are going to be, I think that's better in the long run. So I think we all have to look at this in a way, and we are going to look at this in a way continuing forward of what are we willing to live with. If agriculture is willing to live with some piece of it, as long as you don't get rid of Paul, because Paul needs to be here. Paul is essential to this. We're very supportive of the committee's recommendation this morning, so I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Sandy. Anyone else? Cynthia.
I just want to reiterate what Tim had said earlier about we're excited about the possibility of trying to make a go at the USF to GSF, 77,000 acre feet in Tier 1, potentially. We are looking forward to trying to work through ways to make that credit exchange work in a way, because cities have gift clause issues. And so we have to make sure that we are not stranding assets, but we are committed to making that work. That's why we've been talking to Pinal Ag, Paul, February, March? And for those in the room who Paul represents, there's nobody who's been working on this harder than Paul Orem from day one, before any of this started. He's been working on it. And we're committed to making it work. Everybody's going to end up having a haircut on this because cuts are cuts. And that's what we're going to do to pay for DCP. That is the deal we're making. But Phoenix and the other AMWA cities are committed to trying to find the way to make it work so we can put water in places that we've never put it before in Pinal County. And we're encouraged by DWR and CAP's willingness to talk about options about how to make that happen. So thanks.
Thank you. Tim.
Thank you, Cynthia. Just wanted to also address the comments from Ms. Smallhouse and everybody here, and just make the comment that not all long-term storage credits are created equal. We look at that increase in long-term storage credit amounts, and that leads to the conclusion of that it's with underground storage facilities. In reality, much of that is with groundwater savings facilities. Tucson has long partnered with the agricultural districts in the Tucson AMA. Our partner at BKW Farms down the table can attest to that, and many others, that much of that water that they're using, and one of the reasons they're not needing to ask for mitigation is because they have M&I water already being put to use there. And as we've talked about repeatedly, our intent is to try to extend that into Pinal, work with the Pinal ag districts, assuming we can overcome any institutional issues to doing so, and really deploy the resources at our disposal to help out to the extent that we can. I think as we see when numbers keep getting put together, things get refined, you'll see that we're putting or intending to put everything that we have at our disposal to be a partner in this. And it's been working for us in the Tucson AMA for a decade or more, and to do something over a 7-year period is something that we're more than willing to step up and do.
Thanks, Tim. Winding down around the table. Governor Lewis?
Yes, Tom, yeah, thank you. I know that, we've had a lot of discussion here, and also I'd like to recognize my tribal peers here as well, the Thanaotham Nation and the Colorado River Indian tribes. And they have, I know, their own story, their own perspectives. But what I'd like to just to briefly share too is the community's perspectives here. And first of all, I'd like to, especially with the ag community and the Pinal ag community, I'd like to thank them for, their providing a little bit about their history and everyone's history in regards to ag, in regards to this great state we live in. And history is important, just as much as hydrology is important, even though I could barely understand the hydrology report earlier, but it was difficult to follow, and sometimes we speak a different language here. And but I think one of the tenets of history is that you don't repeat the mistakes in history. And when we look at, I think we sell ourselves short. When we talk about 150 years and 350 years, especially the O'odham, who we trace ourselves to the Hugam civilization, we've been farming for over 1,000 years. And I think we all should be proud of that history of agriculture that has been here from almost time immemorial. We have canal systems that are over 1,000 years old, that were engineered on a par almost with and on the same engineering as the Egyptian canal system here in Arizona, here in our great state. And so I think, when we start to look at, us versus them, I think we all sell ourselves short, and we run the course of making mistakes of when we start to look at policy decisions. There is a drought, but there also is, and I think we all have to understand and we all have to agree that there is a drought, but there also is over-allocation, increased over-allocation of our water, of the river, and overuse as well. We have to really, not blind ourselves to the situation that we're in today. Now, for our community, the Yakima O'odham and the Peepash people, we've welcomed successive peoples to this area. We've welcomed and we've provided for them, from the Spaniards to the Mexican government and the Mexican people. The Mormon settlers that came, and the later American settlers that became this United States and this Southwest and Arizona. We've proudly provided our resources, and I think there is a history there. There are some sad chapters to this history as well. And one of those, of course, we talk about a line of agriculture, and especially O'odham agriculture. And the only time that was disrupted was when our water was taken away from us over 1,000 years ago. over 150 years ago, where we had to mobilize our resources to go back and to historically fight for our water back. And that culminated in the Arizona Water Settlement of 2004, as we all know. Now, all we are asking for at this point, we see ourselves as a moral compass in regards to water, because out of all the groups here, the indigenous people, we were the only ones that water has been taken away from. And we see and we understand and we know, and we have stories, oral history, family stories of the devastation that brought to our people. And some of these social, medical, historical trauma that is still with us today. So we understand full well, and we would be the first ones to defend any other group that would have all of their water taken from them, because we know the devastation firsthand. Now, we have to really put aside a lot of the political posturing that we've had. I think we've had some great discussions moving forward, but there's been a lot of political posturing as well. And I think if we move forward and we respect our positions for our community, and I think we all know, an old axiom is, in different languages, it's translated to water is life. And I think we all know that. And what the community is, we were the first ones to put water. One of the first tribes, if not, we saw the imperative to put water up in Lake Mead. And we continue to look at ways where we can somehow move the ball forward to find, whether through collaboration, whether through innovative ways, to find a solution to this problem that we're dealing with. In the end, what we want, because we have a water settlement, and we look to the federal government, and we look to everyone around this table to recognize that. We still have issues, of course, some of you know, up in the Upper Valley River as well, in regards to finally clarifying our water rights under our water settlement. But it goes back to making sure that our water is not taken again, that there is not a second taking of our water. That's one thing that we will resist with the most strongest fervor. When all we want is fair and equitable treatment within this process moving forward. Because it would be a shame for a sad situation in Arizona's history where water was taken away, to have that happen again. We have to learn from our mistakes from history, and we have to look at new ways to find solutions. And the community, we maintain that we will be here as long as it takes to find solutions. But we will not, and we will fight to the end to make sure that our water is not taken again. And respectfully around the table, thank you very much.
Thank you, Governor Lewis. Anyone else?
Hi. I can speak really loud if I need to. I don't need a microphone, but I just wanted to read a statement that we're making a commitment to the DCP mitigation. I know I've been a part of listening since the first meeting and how the progress we've made, because you have made progress. You're here. That's why we're getting to these fine points that everybody's having discussion on. It's good to have discussion. We were part of the pilot system conservation program established for accounting for the water for the last 2 years since they started that. And we committed 40,000 acre-feet of water for Lake Mead under this program. In regards to the accounting, it is more complicated for water over several years that we are talking with Reclamation, ADWR, CAP about how to account for our system conservation over 7 years while still permitting reasonable changes in farming operations on the reservation from year to year. And we've been moving forward, and I know Chairman Patch has said that, we want to be a help. We're moving forward to try and get federal legislation soon so that we can be more flexible with the help that we can provide. So I just wanted to say that to you, and we're meeting soon to discuss this as a council, just like our other brother down there, because we realize that we've said this for the last 4 years since I've been in office, that we want to be a solution to the problem. We want to help and help overcome some of these hurdles that will provide us more flexibility within this plan. You know, I saw those numbers this morning, BRR, at a different meeting. I saw that presentation, and it does paint a picture that's not very happy, to say the least. And so here we are together in a room. And I would reiterate what everyone has said, that just continue that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Doug?
So I guess I'm also a water hoarder. But I would like to point out that ag also has been a very important partner for us to be able to continue to use our renewable water supplies. And we have said conceptually that we are more than willing to divert some of our efforts up here down to Pinal to help offset Pinal ag. Really willing to explore that further. Would like to put a bow on that if we could. But while I don't have a gift clause to worry about, I do have a stakeholder that I have to answer to, which is my one committee that owns the company, and we have to answer to them. And part of the slowness of our ability to increase our CAP use has been we have another regulatory climate we have to answer to. So I have the Corporation Commission that has put some constraints that is now loosening. Takes us time to get our infrastructure into place. So I have to answer to them, and I will have to be able to protect my ratepayers as we move forward to ensure that they're not negatively impacted. And as we move forward, I also want to kind of point out that it was just a few years ago that California went through that really nasty couple years. And the images that went out nationally of farm fields fallowed, Dust Bowl type stuff, major orchards being ripped up because there's no more water. As someone who depends on growth for new customers to grow our business, that also has a negative impact, even though my customers may not be directly impacted. That's all of us. That's the entire state's image. So even though it's not necessarily a Simon & Garfunkel reference, if we don't hang together, we most certainly will hang separately.
Thank you. Bill?
Just a point to make. I think we've been a pretty good partner for our GSF operator owners with Maricopa Stanfield, CAIDD, Hohokam, Roosevelt Water Conservation District, and Maricopa Water District. We're at nearly full use of our cap allocation and primarily for GSF deliveries. We are not a long-term storage credit, if we use the term hoarder or not. We do annual storage and recovery, and we think it's a benefit both to our company and our ratepayers, our customers, but also to our community partners and with the irrigation districts that I believe will continue. I don't see any reason, Shane and Paul, why we would not continue. I think it's been a very good benefit. I'm encouraged to hear others maybe looking to do the same down in Pinal. I think that's out-of-the-box thinking. I think the things that I think are required for us to come up with a solution. So whatever the numbers are, I think we're all trying to find a solution here because we're all sharing the same water resources within the state. So that's our commitment to continue.
Thank you. Hunter?
So I'd first like to express my appreciation to everybody at the table, and I'd like to congratulate both Ted and Tom for selecting people who have tremendous strength. There are no weak women or men at this table. I'd also like to congratulate them for bringing people who have a tremendous amount of expertise, which is consistent with Arizona's history. We have all the opportunity right now to solve the problem because we have that strength and that wisdom at the table. I appreciate what Stephanie has said. I ask everyone to bring that strength and that wisdom and whatever humility is possible to bring it to the table to solve what needs to be solved right now. I'm encouraged by the fact that although there has been some disagreement today, some significant disagreement and significant risk that has been identified, that I'm not hearing anybody walking away from or seeing anybody walking from the table right now, and that is appreciated. I do ask that in the next several days, the level of candor maintain its present level, but also the civility and so forth. I think this is the environment that we need to be in right now to get the job done, and I would ask that you do that for the state and for each other. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else I'm missing? So for the next steps, clearly we have lots of work to do. Clearly the discussions among parties need to continue. I think clearly the discussions DWRC, AWCD with different stakeholders needs to continue as we try to put together the pieces of this difficult puzzle. And we will continue to do that between now and the next steering committee meeting. We already talked about where we are in the framework for ICS in terms of the next meeting. I will turn now to members of the public who might want to ask questions or make comments about the issues we've talked about here today. Mark.
Thank you. For the record, my name is Mark Lewis, and I'm the most senior member of the Central Arizona Project Board of Directors, and I want to thank you guys for your commitment and time and energy today. And if you get a chance to see our control room, if you haven't seen it, it's really impressive to see how water is flowing through the state. I just want to leave you with three thoughts as I'm watching these proceedings. And number one is I understand that Arizona needs to speak with one voice on water. And we have a multi-state audience in which to communicate. And I understand that whatever comes out of this process, that it be balanced and on the benefits and the losses as we move forward and speak with that one voice. But as I mentioned to the committee the last time, Arizona does need to speak with one voice on water, but that voice needs a checkbook. And that would be the board members over here that have to balance the equation on the benefits and the losses for whatever you come up with. And Ted's little drawing said that we're looking at maybe a $10 million a year plan. And that may or may not be built into the rates, but somebody's got to pay for that. And whatever your policy decisions from this committee happen to be, and you balance that equation, you have to take this back to our board, and we have to deliberate it and go through the appropriations process. The legislature empowered us with rate-making authority to balance these equations. And so it's important, I guess, the message that I'd like to leave with you is come up with a policy, come up with the numbers, and give us enough time to go through the appropriations process to pay for all this stuff. Because we can get there, and we can balance that equation with appropriations and rate-making authority, but we're also, you're looking for a sustainable water supply. I'm looking for a sustainable money supply to balance that equation. And that shouldn't, we don't have the money. You all are going to pay for it. This is where the money comes from. And so I just would leave you with that thought that as we're going through this process of balancing the losses and the benefits among multiple counties, that our one voice needs a checkbook, and that checkbook has $1 billion worth of debt. Please don't forget that. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. And again, what we've discussed a little bit here today, without getting into specific numbers, as Ted talked about earlier in relation to CAWCD, I think it's clear we're trying to put together a package that doesn't totally put 100% of the burden on CAWCD. And we have some opportunities, I think, to do that in different ways. And we will keep that in mind. And I don't think we move forward with concluding from the policy perspective what we need to do without having some good idea about the funding and where we're going to get it from. Because we don't want to put any one of the funding parties potentially on the spot to say, you've got to do this. We know that is probably a recipe for failure, not success. Anyone else in the audience want to speak to the issues for discussion today? If not, a couple things. I want to say something at the end, but first, I think we talked at the beginning of this meeting about a download on the DCP documents. Nicole, do you have some idea about how long that will take? 2 or 3 minutes, 2 or 3 hours. How about the 20 or so minute version to get us to 5 o'clock? And they have been. We wanted to give a quick download to give people context and help them maybe better refine where they want to go, what they want to look at, and how it all fits together is probably actually the most important part of this. So before we get to that, I just want to say, today's discussion regarding the mitigation aspects, we certainly expected conversations that really get into this balancing act that we've heard about, this balancing act that's DCP. We don't really think it changes anything. We still think there's forward momentum, and we're going to continue to work through these complex issues to come together to craft the implementation package and framework. And I was very impressed to hear, as we went around the room, a reiteration of that commitment, despite the tough discussions we had today, to make that happen. So many of you spoke very eloquently as to the need and your desire to keep working on this. So we much appreciate that effort and attention, and look forward to continue these discussions to try to achieve what I think we all want is success. So thanks. We will not take a break before Nicole. And is Jay going to help you, or is it just you now? Before Jay and Nicole give us their brief discussion of the drought contingency plan documents. And if folks would like to or need to leave, feel free to do so. And we'll just march into it. And you need microphones so that everyone can hear.
Is that it? Okay. All right.
Thanks to those of you who are sticking around.
We had the pleasure, Nicole and I, to work on a committee of the principals group for DCP. It was the coordinating committee, and it was Nicole and I and members from California, Nevada for the lower basin, and for all the upper basin states as well. And we all worked on drafting our respective DCP documents, and there are 5 of those documents we'll cover briefly today. You've gotten a download before on the major points from the lower basin DCP agreement, although that agreement hasn't been released. There have been some changes to that, but mainly the points that you heard before are pretty much in line with what you heard. There are also 2 DCP documents from the Upper Basin and another document that we call the Companion Agreement that is an agreement that is all of the DCP parties from Upper and Lower Basin plus the Secretary will be signatory to. So where would you like to start?
Well, I think the companion agreement is probably the one document that ties everything together. And the idea of the companion agreement is that all of the parties to both the Upper Basin DCP agreements and the Lower Basin DCP agreements, including the Secretary of the Interior, will be parties to the companion agreement and will agree to adhere to all of the DCP provisions of both DCPs, to operate in good faith, to attempt to resolve any claims or controversies through a consultative and consensus-based approach. There are also some specific provisions related to some of the Upper Basin DCP provisions. The 2 Upper Basin DCP provisions have some plans to be developed in the future or potentially to be investigated for potential development. So they're not as clear-cut as the Lower Basin provisions that we've been detailing for you. And as a result, we have some very specific provisions related to consultation with the Lower Basin on how those plans develop moving forward. So all of those different elements are encompassed in the companion agreement. And one of the other critical aspects of it is that it includes a reference to the provision of law that allows us to sue the Secretary for enforcement of the entire package. So that allows everybody in a worst-case scenario to make sure that all of the Upper Basin and Lower Basin DCPs are enforced just as they were intended to be, that they are implemented properly, and to ensure that, if necessary, through the courts.
Yeah, it's, as you see the document, and these, of course, have all been released, and you can get them through a link that will be on the CAWCD site, and the documents, I believe, are on the ADWR site. But the companion agreement's pretty straightforward. Like Nicole said, it's, the parties pledge to support the respective DCPs and go forth with federal legislation, and there are reservation of rights, joint defense agreement, and a consultative approach to disputes. So pretty straightforward, but an important agreement. And as Nicole said, it incorporates some specific needs of the Lower Basin with respect to the next 2 documents we're going to discuss. And I guess I'll jump right into the agreement that's their operations agreement, which is really the Upper Basin agreeing that they will work toward operating the initial units of the Colorado River Storage Project Act, the reservoirs above Lake Powell, in a manner to protect a target volume or a target elevation in Lake Powell, and that target elevation being 3525. And really the framework of this, they've put together a construct of or framework of what this program for operation will look like. And the Lower Basin is not a signatory to this agreement. This is just an Upper Basin agreement.
Yeah, I think the main purpose of this agreement is so that the Upper Basin can incorporate that protection of that elevation in Lake Powell as one of the factors that they consider in their reservoir operations above Lake Powell. The next agreement is another Upper Basin agreement that Arizona will not be signing, none of the lower basin parties will be signing. And that is the Demand Management Storage Agreement. This is a relatively new concept, and I want to be very clear that there is no commitment to establish a demand management storage program. It's a very contentious issue in the Upper Basin. You may hear a little bit about that, particularly coming from Colorado, but I know that all of the states have a lot of concerns that would have to be addressed before that can be established. Essentially, what this agreement does is it will, once authorized by Congress, it will provide a way for it will provide authorization for a storage program to be established. The storage will be free of charge, with the intent that it would be a long-term storage program in order to for the purpose of compact compliance. And what that means is that if there's a compact call, that water would be released in order to meet the requirements of the compact call to deliver water to the lower basin. One of the critical aspects here is that to the extent that they are able to agree and establish a program, then that water would not be released during normal operations under the guidelines. And one of the reasons that we needed extensive lower basin consultation provisions for this is because we would only agree to this if the Upper Basin is able to put together a program that clearly establishes that the water is conserved and is actually conveyed to the reservoir. And because the Upper Basin operations are so different than what we're used to here in the Lower Basin, it, I think, is going to be that's a pretty heavy lift for them to put together that program and ensure that the water is stored, that there's no interception of the water on the way to the reservoir through the priority system, things like that. They still have a lot of feasibility work to do in the Upper Basin. So again, we're not sure whether they will be standing up a program. This gives them the opportunity to investigate it in consultation with the Lower Basin states and the Secretary, obviously.
And in the companion agreement specifically, there is the requirement for the Upper Basin to consult with the Lower Basin on this issue of accounting and verification of this demand management program. And they're required to do this at the feasibility point, and then later on, if they get past the feasibility level and they're actually standing up a program before they have executed an agreement. Once again, there's a consultation requirement. And then beyond that, if it actually ever goes into place, there is an annual requirement to report and answer questions of the Upper Basin, or the Lower Basin, excuse me, on that issue. That's about it.
Okay, so then we can move on to the two Lower Basin documents. And in the Lower Basin, we have one agreement and one document. And the idea is that while we're all agreeing to implement certain provisions, those provisions will apply throughout the Lower Basin. And so we have a separate guideline. It's not, well, I don't want to say a guideline document because we already have guidelines. It's an operations document. And but the first of the Lower Basin documents is the Lower Basin Drought Contingency Plan Agreement. And that is the document that the parties will sign to actually agree to the provisions in the operations document. It will also effectively modify the forbearance agreement from 2007, as well as the applicable forbearance agreements in 2012 and 2017 associated with the creation of binational ICS, to allow for the new added flexibility for all of those different ICS programs that were established. And it also includes a provision for proposals of future ICS exhibits, with a commitment to consider those proposed exhibits within 120 days and give a meaningful explanation if the exhibits are rejected.
Right, and other than that, the typical general provisions that we see in the companion agreement, a consultative approach to dispute resolution, and reservation of rights, et cetera. Pretty simple document. It's about 10 pages long, but it's double-spaced. It's really, it ties into it attaches as an exhibit the actual document that is the operations document. And it has a kind of an unfortunate acronym, but that was...
Or fortunate, depending on...
Yeah, right. It's called the LBOPS, and then that's attributed to a lawyer in Nevada who came up with that. But the LBOPS is the Lower Basin Drought Contingency Operations document. And a lot of the terms of that, we went through in one of these meetings, a couple of months ago, and walked through a lot of the provisions that detail the new concept of DCP, ICS, and all of the parameters that surround how it is created, stored, ultimately delivered. So I guess we can just sort of quickly run through what's in this agreement. We have about 7 minutes. First of all, it discusses how this is an overlay on the 2007 guidelines, and if there's a conflict between the 07 guidelines and the LBOPS will govern. And then we have definitions that introduce, the DCP ICS concept and how to create DCP contributions. And of course, that's the crux of this document in the program, is that each of the states are required to make DCP contributions that are over and above what were required under the 07 guidelines. And so there's there are sections that describe how this will happen, what the amounts are, and if the amounts are not, the contributions are not made, then the Secretary is authorized to make delivery schedule adjustments to ensure that the contributions are made. If a party does not make all of its contribution in a given year, then in the following year there can be adjustments made so that the exact amount is in fact contributed. Jump in at any time here. We've got
and then the delivery provisions both for DCP ICS and then for other ICS, which include the additional, for the other ICS, it includes that additional flexibility that we've discussed throughout the process, and particularly in the ICS work group. I think we've gone through that. Hopefully everything makes sense as you read through it and helps to put some of these concepts into place in your mind. Realistically, I know that sometimes when lawyers start writing things down, it actually makes it more complicated and harder to understand. So we're happy to field questions after you have some time to peruse the documents.
Yeah, it's kind of pointless right now for us to go through bit by bit, and we won't. But, like I said, you've had a download before of what is generally in this document. We want you to go through it, take a close look at it, and happy to get back together and answer questions, which I'm sure there'll be plenty.
For the next steering committee. That's what the goal is. All your questions, we can go through and give you all the answers at the next steering committee meeting. I see Ted had a question or comment.
Yeah, just a quick clarifying question. There's a provision in here that talks about federal legislation and says it's attached as Appendix C, which I didn't see. Does that appendix not exist yet, or what's going on with that?
So we, the intent is that the legislation will be very simple, like a couple of sentences or one sentence or half a page at most, that would essentially say that the Secretary is authorized and directed to execute and implement each of the agreements that you see here upon execution by all of the other parties to those agreements. I think we don't yet have final federal legislative language, or I guess final draft language, because we are not yet at a point where I think the parties are ready to proceed with seeking the federal legislation. Hopefully, the parties will be there in the near future, but that's obviously something that all 7 states have to be ready to do.
So let me add to that. Ted and I made a commitment to Senator Griffin, Representative Bowers, to track back with them before we would start pursuing the federal legislation. And I think the concept was, how comfortable are they in taking the temperature of the legislature in proceeding to get conditional, but still federal legislation prior to the state resolution. And I think that probably connects, in my mind at least, to how far down the road we are on having a collaborative deal, the deal that we've been working on in this steering committee.
Okay. Thank you.
So I think we're adjourned. Thanks, everyone.